From the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, the high priest of Ptah held immense authority within the kingdom. Since the nation's unification, Memphis had served as the capital, and Ptah, its primary god, made the city a key religious center. As a result, Ptah's leading priest, known in ancient ceremonial terms as the greatest of craftsmen, was among the highest-ranking religious figures, charged with upholding Egypt's sacred traditions. Although officially appointed by the king, this role often passed down through generations, adhering more closely to the deeply rooted ideal of heredity than to royal decree. During the Ptolemaic period, one powerful family controlled the office continuously for more than 260 years, with each generation handing the position to the next. These priests not only preserved their lineage but also maintained strong loyalty to the monarchy, becoming one of the most influential native dynasties in the kingdom. In contrast to the priests of Ammonius in Thebes, who showed only modest support for the Greek rulers, the priests of Ptah and Memphis were unwavering allies of the Ptolemies. They freely offered their religious endorsement in return for royal favor. Although their counterparts in the south might have viewed such loyalty with disdain, this pragmatic cooperation was, in many ways, consistent with long-standing Egyptian traditions. At the time of Cleopatra's birth in 69 BCE, the reigning high priest of Ptah, Pasherenta, had more reason than most of his forebears to align closely with the ruling regime. He assumed the role at just 15 years old and, early in his service, had the honor of crowning Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII. As a member of the king's inner circle, Pasherenta enjoyed considerable influence and could confidently claim a role at the very heart of Egypt's leadership. Over the next 4 decades, the paths of Cleopatra and Pasherenta would remain closely linked. Their relationship, between a powerful priest and a royal heir, marks the beginning of the final chapter in ancient Egypt's long history. From birth, Cleopatra was treated as semi-divine. Her father was exalted as the new Dionysus, or, in Egyptian tradition, the young Osiris. The established royal cult of the Ptolemies, deeply intertwined with Egyptian religious customs, upheld the notion of the king as a living god. The priesthood, led by Pasherenta, had no qualms about embracing and endorsing the divinity of the royal family. Such beliefs had been part of Egyptian theology since its earliest days. However, Ptolemy I's reign was far from prosperous. Rather than enjoying wealth from agriculture and trade, his rule saw a sharp and steady decline in national stability. At the core of Egypt's troubles was the burden of protection payments. The country was no longer a dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. Of the once expansive Ptolemaic territories, only Cyprus remained, governed by the king's brother. Meanwhile, Rome had emerged as a powerful force, intent on expanding its reach. For countries like Egypt, there were only 2 choices: resist and face destruction, or submit and collaborate. By 75 BCE, Rome had already taken control of Cyrenaica, another Ptolemaic possession. Determined not to lose Egypt, Ptolemy XII chose to align with Rome, the lesser of 2 evils. Rome, ever predatory, was quick to exploit any vulnerability. A legal will left by Ptolemy X, which appeared to grant Egypt to Rome, gave the empire all the justification it needed to begin extracting wealth from the Nile Valley. Egypt had little choice but to comply. Payment was non-negotiable. When Cleopatra was only 4 years old, these realities became undeniable. Far away in the Roman Senate, ambitious leaders began using Egypt as a political bargaining chip. In 65 BCE, Crassus proposed turning Egypt into a Roman province. The idea was challenged by Cicero, who argued it would destabilize the Republic, and so it was delayed for a time. Rome's attention then shifted to an easier conquest, the Seleucid kingdom of Western Asia. Pompey the Great quickly crushed this longtime rival of the Ptolemies and brought it under Roman control. Eager to align himself with Rome's rising power, Ptolemy XII responded by sending 8,000 cavalrymen to assist Pompey's campaign in Palestine. While this generous act was meant to secure favor, it came at a steep cost. The Egyptian treasury was depleted, leading to increased taxes and reduced public services, sparking civil unrest. Despite this, maintaining Rome's approval remained Ptolemy's top priority, regardless of the strain it placed on his people. Pompey, embodying Roman arrogance, offered no help when the tax hikes triggered a rebellion. His indifference only underscored Egypt's vulnerable position, trapped between maintaining internal stability and appeasing a powerful foreign overlord. Egypt should have taken a lesson from this unfortunate experience, but its overly trusting approach to foreign affairs seemed to have a momentum of its own. As the nation sank deeper into debt to its overbearing protector, resentment among Egyptians toward Rome and all it represented grew steadily. This boded poorly for the stability of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. To complicate matters further, Rome was being pulled in two directions by rival power players. Pleasing Pompey alone was insufficient. Julius Caesar wielded just as much influence. Egypt faced a double-edged threat and needed to appease both sides. In 59 BCE, when Caesar hinted that he would raise the Egyptian question again in the Roman Senate, Ptolemy responded with his usual tactic. He paid a massive bribe, amounting to half of Egypt's annual income, in exchange for formal acknowledgement as the rightful king of Egypt and as a friend and ally of the Roman people. Yet this gesture brought little benefit. Within a year, while Ptolemy was celebrating the wedding of his close ally, High Priest Pasherenta, to a 14-year-old girl, Rome seized Cyprus. The island's ruler, Ptolemy's brother, took his own life, and the joyous occasion quickly turned tragic. Still, Ptolemy remained silent, unwilling to provoke Roman wrath. By this point, the king's moral integrity was as depleted as his nation's finances. For the proud citizens of Alexandria, it was too much to bear. Outraged, they rose in revolt and expelled their king, sending him into exile. A disgraced Ptolemy first traveled to Rhodes to plead his case before the Roman official who had accepted Cyprus's surrender. In a final indignity, he was forced to meet Marcus Porcius Cato while the magistrate sat on the toilet, thanks to a particularly effective laxative. Once, pharaohs had ruled over foreign nations. Now, one had been reduced to less than an afterthought, a humiliating reminder of how far Egypt had fallen. Yet instead of reassessing its situation, the Ptolemaic dynasty clung to the same self-destructive patterns. In Alexandria, the throne was first offered to Ptolemy's wife, and, after her sudden death, to his eldest daughter, Berenike. The idea of a woman ruling alone was deeply offensive to Greek tradition, so the search began for a male consort. But Berenike, true to her bloodline, proved as ruthless and defiant as her forebears. Her first intended husband died on the journey. The second was intercepted by Roman authorities before crossing into Egypt. And the third, having arrived in Alexandria, was strangled within days when Berenike found him completely unworthy. Meanwhile, Ptolemy traveled from Rhodes to Ephesus, and then on to Rome, where he stayed for 2 years beginning in 57 BCE. While in exile, he played the classic role of the deposed autocrat, ordering the elimination of his political enemies back home while enjoying a lavish lifestyle in foreign mansions. Eventually, he secured what he had come for, in return for a staggering sum of 10,000 talents, the equivalent of Egypt's full annual revenue, borrowed from a banker named Rabirius, who could hardly believe his good fortune. Ptolemy secured military backing for his return. The Roman governor of Syria, Gabinius, agreed to lead the campaign. On April 15, 55 BCE, with Gabinius and his troops at his side, Ptolemy marched triumphantly back into Alexandria. He reclaimed the throne, executed his daughter Berenike, and rewarded Rabirius by appointing him finance minister. At that point, Egypt wasn't just under Rome's influence. It had become little more than a financial extension of the Roman Empire. For Ptolemy XII, regaining the throne came at the cost of complete humiliation. During his 2-year exile in Rome, Ptolemy XII seemed to find solace in the company of a cherished companion. Evidence suggests that one of his daughters accompanied him on his journey through Rhodes, Ephesus, and Rome. While her exact identity remains uncertain, Cleopatra is the most plausible candidate. At the time of her father's expulsion, she was 11 years old enough to travel, yet young enough to leave Egypt without being seen as a threat to her older sister, Berenike. If Cleopatra did indeed spend those formative years in Rome, the experience would have taught her critical political lessons. Ptolemaic rulers could not fully submit to Roman authority, nor could they afford to ignore it. To keep the crown and safeguard national sovereignty required exceptional finesse and the ability to navigate an incredibly narrow path. Cleopatra would soon be walking that path alone. Upon returning to Egypt, Ptolemy XII quickly moved to consolidate his position with the priesthood and the broader population. Since the days of Narmer, Egyptian kings had strengthened their legitimacy by building temples and touring religious sites. Nearly 3,000 years later, Ptolemy saw no need to deviate from this tradition. He commissioned the construction of a grand new temple to the goddess Hathor at Unit in Upper Egypt, laying its foundation stone on July 16, 54 BCE. Around the same time, he made an official visit to Memphis, accompanied by Pasherenta, the high priest of Ptah and a key figure in the native elite. These actions were calculated demonstrations of pharaonic authority. To further secure his family's future, Ptolemy named Cleopatra as his formal co-ruler in 52 BCE. After nearly 30 years of precarious rule, he may have sensed that the end was near. On March 7, 51 BCE, a solar eclipse cast a shadow over Egypt, widely interpreted as a foreboding omen. Days later, Ptolemy XII died, and Cleopatra ascended to the throne at just 17. According to her father's wishes, Cleopatra was to rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, while Rome was appointed guardian of their reign. Like many Ptolemaic power-sharing arrangements, it was bound for conflict. Initially, Cleopatra attempted to govern independently, sidelining her young brother and taking control for the first year and a half. However, a string of environmental and political misfortunes soon eroded public support. In the summer of 50 BCE, an abnormally low Nile flood resulted in poor harvests and food shortages. To stave off famine, Cleopatra implemented emergency policies. Yet her inability to secure the favor of the gods so early in her reign cast a shadow over her legitimacy. She worsened her standing by agreeing to extradite fugitives from Syria who had assassinated the sons of a Roman governor. Sending them to their deaths reinforced widespread fears that Egypt was now under Rome's thumb. Public opinion quickly shifted, favoring her brother over her. At the same time, Cleopatra faced growing tension beyond Egypt's borders. Rome was being torn apart by civil war between its two most powerful generals, Pompey and Caesar. Out of loyalty to her father's former benefactor, Cleopatra aligned with Pompey, whose ally Gabinius had previously reinstated Ptolemy XII. But even a Roman alliance couldn't shield her from the backlash at home. In early 48 BCE, Cleopatra, like her father before her, was driven into exile. This time, however, she didn't turn to Rome. Instead, she set out to raise an army in nearby Palestine, where she still commanded loyalty. By late summer, Egypt stood divided, with opposing forces rallying behind Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, ready for confrontation in the eastern Nile Delta. Ptolemy XIII, already officially recognized by Rome as the sole ruler of Egypt, likely felt emboldened in his position. But when Pompey, freshly defeated by Caesar in Greece, sought refuge in Egypt on August 9, 48 BCE, Ptolemy's confidence veered into recklessness. Standing by the harbor in Alexandria, he watched without emotion as Pompey was brought ashore, only to be immediately stabbed to death by one of his former officers, now loyal to Ptolemy. The Roman general never even stepped onto Egyptian soil. Ptolemy may have believed that eliminating Caesar's enemy would win him favor, but he had gravely misjudged the situation. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria just 4 days later and was presented with Pompey's severed and preserved head, he reacted with fury at the brutal murder of a fellow Roman. He went directly to the royal palace, made it his residence, and summoned Ptolemy XIII for a meeting. Recognizing the significance of Caesar's arrival, now the undisputed master of Rome, Cleopatra saw a critical opportunity. Avoiding her brother's guards, she slipped into the palace undetected and joined Caesar's audience. So began one of history's most legendary encounters. In the oppressive August heat of Alexandria, Cleopatra, 21 years old, met Caesar, aged 52. By modern standards, her sharp features, an aquiline nose, and narrow chin might not be called beautiful, and Caesar, weathered from years of military campaigns, was far from youthful. Still, attraction is often shaped by power, and the connection between them sparked immediately. To the shock and outrage of Ptolemy XIII and his followers, Caesar backed Cleopatra's claim to the throne. In retaliation, Ptolemy's forces surrounded the palace, while his allies in the city declared Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, queen in her place. But the tide turned quickly. In March of 47 BCE, Roman reinforcements arrived, broke the siege, and violent clashes erupted. During the chaos, Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile. With her rival gone, Cleopatra was reinstated as ruler, this time sharing the throne with her younger brother, another Ptolemy, just 11 years old. As a further gesture of Roman support, Cyprus was returned to Egypt. Arsinoe was captured and taken to Italy as a prisoner. To mark their victory, Cleopatra and Caesar journeyed up the Nile together. But the presence of 400 Roman warships accompanying them offered little joy to the Egyptian people. Cleopatra had secured her position, but Egypt had paid the price. 3 Roman legions remained stationed in the Nile Valley, a stark reminder of the new reality. Caesar, in his writings, made the purpose of this military presence clear. The king and queen would be protected by Roman troops so long as they remained loyal. If they defied Rome, those same forces would ensure their compliance. Caesar's departure wasn't the end of his influence. In the summer of 47 BCE, after he left Egypt to resume his campaigns, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. Unmistakably claiming his lineage, she named him Ptolemy Caesar. To commemorate the birth, Cleopatra ordered special coins to be minted in Cyprus. Adorned with the symbol of the double cornucopia, the coins celebrated the prosperity and promise of Egypt's union with Rome through her son. A year after Cleopatra's child was born, another arrival, this time to a different family, was celebrated with equal joy and gratitude. Unlike Cleopatra's experience, both parents were present to share the moment. The proud father was the high priest Pasherenta, and the mother was his wife of 12 years, Ptolemy. Their happiness was especially profound, given the emotional hardship that had come before. In the early years of their marriage, Ptolemy had given birth to 3 healthy daughters. While this was a blessing, it fell short of fulfilling Pasherenta's deepest wish for a male heir. In ancient Egypt, sons were essential, especially for a man of his stature. The high priest of Ptah and holder of a sacred office passed down through 11 generations. As he reached the age of 43, Pasherenta must have wondered whether his lineage would end with him. In her desperation, Imhotep turned to the ancient deities, and one god in particular, Imhotep. Once a royal courtier to the pharaoh Nedrikit during the dawn of the Pyramid Age, Imhotep had become revered as a god of wisdom, healing, and magical power. His greatest achievement, the Step Pyramid, still dominated the skyline of Memphis, where his cult remained especially strong. Imhotep herself, a native of Memphis, carried his name, making the connection even more personal. If any divine being could grant their wish for a son, it would surely be Imhotep. So, she prayed alongside her husband to the god renowned for granting children to the childless. Amazingly, her prayers were answered. Imhotep appeared to her in a dream, promising that she would bear a son, on the condition that she arranged to beautify his shrine in Memphis. A sacred exchange was struck. If she honored him, he would bless her. With Pasherenta being one of the most powerful figures in the city and head of the local religious establishment, the shrine was quickly restored. Builders and artisans must have worked swiftly. On the afternoon of July 15th, 46 BCE, Ptolemy delivered a long-awaited son. The city of Memphis erupted in celebration. He was named Imhotep, also called Patabastet, and was welcomed with overwhelming joy. For Ptolemy, the birth of a son fulfilled her duty as a wife and safeguarded her husband's legacy. In Cleopatra's case, however, the arrival of her own son carried greater symbolic and religious meaning. To honor the birth of Caesar Ion, Little Caesar, Cleopatra consecrated a rooftop sanctuary at Unit, a temple devoted to the mother goddess Hathor. In another sacred city, Uni, known to the Greeks as Hermonthis, she built a birth house to glorify the divine act of creation. In Ptolemy and Alexandria, Egypt's prominent Hellenistic cities, Cleopatra also advanced the worship of Isis, a beloved Egyptian goddess whom she personally identified with. Isis, known as a divine mother and protector, had long been venerated for shielding her son Horus, and many saw echoes of that relationship in Cleopatra and her child. The royal image makers of the day encouraged the comparison, blending Isis's traditional symbols with Cleopatra's likeness. In doing so, they merged goddess and queen into a single sacred figure. Cleopatra possessed a stronger claim to being an Egyptian deity than any of her Ptolemaic predecessors. Unlike the kings before her, she made the effort to learn the Egyptian language, signaling a deeper connection to the land she ruled. She clearly regarded Egypt as her true home and took active steps to honor its time-honored religious traditions. Embracing a feminine form of the Horus title, one of the most ancient and sacred expressions of divine kingship, she earned recognition from many Egyptians as a legitimate pharaoh. It is therefore somewhat surprising that, during the height of her popularity, Cleopatra chose to leave Egypt and accompany Caesar to Rome upon his return from campaign in 46 BCE. For 2 years, she resided at his estate across the Tiber River. Their relationship quickly became the subject of gossip, especially after Caesar commissioned a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix. His plans to propose legislation allowing him to marry outside of Italy, despite being already married, have children with a foreign queen, and potentially establish a new capital city, fed into Roman fears. Many believe that their revered general was falling under the spell of an exotic Eastern ruler. Those concerns evaporated with Caesar's assassination on March 15, 44 BCE. Within a month, Cleopatra departed Rome and returned to Alexandria. Not long after, her co-regent and younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, died under circumstances that raised no questions. She then installed her son Caesar Ion as king, under the name Ptolemy XV, styling him the god who loves his father and mother. To Cleopatra, the parallels between her life and the divine narratives of Egypt were becoming ever clearer. Caesar, like Osiris, had been slain. Caesar Ion, like Horus, was the heir of a murdered father, and she herself, now a widowed queen, had fully assumed the role of the living Isis. Despite Cleopatra's rise to near-divine stature, it seemed the gods had turned their backs on Egypt. A series of poor Nile floods between 43 and 41 BCE led to food shortages that plagued both cities and the countryside. Desperation spread among the people. With spirits broken and stomachs empty, they could no longer find comfort in the thought of the afterlife. Rather than a peaceful continuation of life, death came to be feared, seen as an extension of earthly suffering. 2,000 years of religious faith began to unravel. No one captured this growing despair more powerfully than Ptolemy. On February 15, 42 BCE, she died at the age of 30, leaving behind her husband, her long-awaited son, and 3 daughters. As the wife of the high priest of Ptah, her funerary monument was carved from fine pale limestone and adorned with intricate artistry by Egypt's most skilled craftsmen. The upper panel displayed a delicate scene of Ptolemy paying homage to the most revered gods of the land: Anubis, the embalmer; Horus, the divine sun; Nephthys and Isis, Osiris's mourning sisters; the sacred Apis bull of Memphis; and Soker Osiris, the ruler of the dead. The iconography reflected Egypt's enduring religious legacy, but the inscription beneath told a different story. Written in 21 lines of beautifully inscribed hieroglyphs, the text expressed a sorrowful, almost defiant message, one that captured the somber mood of the age. "O my brother, my husband, my friend, high priest, do not tire of eating, drinking, making love, and enjoying life. Celebrate. Follow your heart day and night. Let no worry settle in your heart. What value are your years otherwise? For the West is the land of sleep. Darkness hangs over the place of the dead." Amenhotep's epitaph remains one of the most intimate and sorrowful laments from ancient Egypt. It is a haunting reflection of a civilization coming to terms with the erosion of its ancient assurances and divine order. The outlook for Egypt and its people had grown increasingly grim. With Caesar's assassination, the country lost its most powerful protector. It was uncertain how his assassins or his successors would now treat Cleopatra and her kingdom. Adding to the tension, Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe, recently released from captivity in Rome and now residing in Ephesus, became a natural rallying point for those discontented within the Ptolemaic territories. Cleopatra's resolve was put to the test as first Cassius, then Mark Antony and Octavian, approached Egypt seeking military support. Relying on her sharp political instincts, she aligned herself with Caesar's loyal followers. Her gamble paid off when Antony triumphed over Cassius and Brutus at the Battle of Philippi, securing Egypt's safety, at least temporarily. But that safety came with an unexpected cost: Cleopatra's entanglement with another powerful Roman general. It's possible that Cleopatra and Antony first met in 55 BCE, when he served in Egypt as a young cavalry commander under Gabinius. They may have crossed paths again during Cleopatra's 2-year stay in Rome between 46 and 44 BCE. Their real connection, however, began during their third encounter. In the summer of 41 BCE, after a formal alliance had been formed between Egypt and Caesar's successors, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in southeastern Anatolia. Fresh from his victory at Philippi, Antony was preparing to challenge the Parthians, Rome's remaining major rival in the east. For this, he needed a strategic base in the eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt was the perfect option. At the same time, Cleopatra was in desperate need of a new Roman ally. Their meeting, therefore, was one of mutual interest. With her signature flair for symbolism and spectacle, Cleopatra transformed their diplomatic encounter into something far more theatrical. She arrived by boat, portraying herself as the goddess Aphrodite, merged with the Egyptian Isis, coming to greet her divine partner, Dionysus. The comparison surely flattered Antony, who was both captivated by her charisma and seduced by the allure of a queen 14 years his junior. Like Caesar before him, Antony offered his support in return for her companionship. Even the sorrowful news of Pascherina's death on July 14th failed to dampen Cleopatra's enthusiasm. By the end of the year, the pair had returned together to Alexandria. 9 months later, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named after the sun and the moon, symbolic children of a supposedly divine union. But the illusion of a heavenly match quickly shattered. Soon after the twins were born, Antony left Egypt and returned to Rome. There, he brokered a political alliance with his rival Octavian by marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia, thus abandoning Cleopatra. The Queen of Egypt should perhaps have recognized the pattern. An affair with a Roman general rarely ended well, and once again she found herself raising children alone. Despite Antony's absence, Egypt enjoyed a temporary period of calm. For the next 3 years, the kingdom was largely free from the constant upheaval, rebellions, power struggles, and political schemes that had long characterized Ptolemaic rule. The young Imhotep, only 7 years old, was appointed high priest of Ptah, inheriting the sacred role passed down through his lineage. Meanwhile, the Nile's annual flooding returned to its normal levels, revitalizing agriculture and bringing some much-needed relief. Had it not been for the massive foreign debt inherited from Ptolemy I's administration, Egypt's economy might have fully recovered. But as it stood, the treasury was depleted. The country's silver coinage, once high in purity, was reduced from 90% to 40%, and then nearly disappeared altogether. In its place, the economy relied increasingly on bronze currency. Egypt's legendary wealth was no longer enriching its own people. It was being siphoned off to fuel Rome's ambitions. Eager to conquer Parthia and further elevate his reputation, Antony had, by the autumn of 37 BCE, concluded that Octavian would not offer his support. Once again, Egypt appeared to be the most promising ally. Antony journeyed eastward to Antioch, where he arranged a second meeting with Cleopatra. As a gesture of goodwill, he gifted her the vast library of the kings of Pergamum, said to contain 200,000 scrolls, a symbolic replacement for the books lost from the Library of Alexandria during Caesar's conflict with Pompey years earlier. Antony also granted Cleopatra control over various Roman territories across the eastern Mediterranean, allowing her to present herself as a revivalist monarch restoring her ancestors' once mighty empire. To mark this supposed resurgence, she initiated a new dating system, declaring the 16th year of her reign as the beginning of a new era. But it was an illusion. The lands Antony handed over weren't his to give. In exchange for genuine military aid and supplies, Cleopatra received dubious political titles and a collection of texts. In earlier times, Egypt had been feared and revered as the dominant force in Asia. Now, it was little more than Rome's obedient provider. Due to inadequate planning and an overconfident approach, Antony's initial campaign against Parthia ended in complete failure. Within months, he lost a third of his infantry and nearly half his cavalry to a determined foe. The only bright spot of that year was the birth of another son by Cleopatra, Ptolemy Philadelphus. In 34 BCE, a renewed offensive brought Cleopatra to the Euphrates River with Antony. While his campaign resulted in only a modest success in Armenia, Antony staged a grand spectacle in Alexandria to inflate the victory's significance. During what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra appeared in public on silver thrones, she styled as the goddess Isis. Antony boldly declared their children rulers of Rome's eastern provinces. Cleopatra and Caesar were assigned Egypt, Cyprus, Cyrenaica, and Coele Syria. Alexander Helios, adorned in Persian attire, was given dominion over Armenia, Media, and Parthia, despite Parthia never having been conquered. Meanwhile, the toddler Ptolemy Philadelphus, dressed in Macedonian fashion, was awarded Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. The two sons were acclaimed kings of kings, destined to govern a reborn Eastern Empire. But this was pure fantasy. Cleopatra's enthusiastic participation and open support for Antony provoked Rome's scorn. Senators and citizens alike viewed these Eastern monarchic dreams with deep suspicion and disdain. A remarkable papyrus from this turbulent time offers insight into Egypt's worsening condition. Dated February 23, 33 BCE, it records a royal decree granting extraordinary tax exemptions to Publius Canidius, Antony's chief military aide. Cleopatra authorized him to export 10,000 sacks of wheat annually, emphasizing Egypt's role as Rome's granary, and to import 5,000 amphorae of wine, all tax-free. Furthermore, he and his tenants were exempted from taxation on his Egyptian estates, effectively placing him outside the kingdom's financial laws. As political favors go, this one was massive and audacious. The order was addressed to a top official in Alexandria with instructions to disseminate the policy. At the bottom, the Greek word genestoi, meaning make it happen, was added. It may have been Cleopatra's own handwriting. If so, this was less a tax ruling than a signature on her own demise. Throughout 33 BCE, it became clear once more that Rome could not tolerate two dominant leaders. With control over the eastern territories and allies in the Senate, Antony seemed to have the upper hand. But Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and legal heir, was equally resolute. Just as Caesar and Pompey had clashed years earlier, so too did Antony and Octavian allow personal ambition to spiral into full-blown civil war. Cleopatra's deep alignment with Antony made her an easy target. Octavian portrayed her as the foreign seductress corrupting a Roman hero, using her to draw a sharp line between his own image as the noble Roman and Antony's perceived betrayal. Even though Cleopatra's ruler, Caesar Ion, was Caesar's biological son, that did not matter to Octavian. To him, Cleopatra symbolized everything foreign and dangerous to Roman ideals. Now, both her fate and the fate of Egypt hinged entirely on the outcome of Rome's internal strife. As tensions escalated between the rival Roman factions, Cleopatra and Antony set sail from Alexandria at the head of a fleet of 200 Egyptian vessels. After brief stops in Ephesus and Samos, they eventually arrived in Athens. There, Antony publicly renounced Octavia, formally severing his connection with Octavian's camp. When spring arrived in 31 BCE, the conflict officially erupted into war. It quickly became clear that Antony's inflated ambitions were not matched by strategic competence. By early September, his troops were cornered in western Greece, and his fleet was trapped in a large bay. The only viable option left was to attempt a naval escape under enemy fire. The Battle of Actium on September 2nd was less a grand confrontation and more a chaotic retreat. Antony and Cleopatra managed to escape with their lives and only 60 of their 230 ships. He headed to Libya. She returned to Alexandria. Understanding that defeated leaders rarely survived, Cleopatra made efforts to disguise their return as a triumph. Her ships were adorned to give the illusion of victory. When Antony arrived at the palace days later, they both worked to maintain a facade of stability. A grand celebration was held to mark Caesarion's coming of age, a royal ceremony designed to entertain the public and distract them from the grim political reality. Meanwhile, the mechanisms of government continued to function. Decrees were issued, taxes collected. In Jebtu, a guild of linen makers finalized a contract with 2 priests to fund the local bull cult, a reminder of the enduring Egyptian blend of bureaucracy and religious devotion. To some, it may have seemed that pharaonic tradition would endure forever. Yet behind this show of continuity, Cleopatra was frantically preparing for permanent exile. She had what remained of her fleet dragged overland from the Nile to the Red Sea, hoping to send Caesar Ion to safety in India. But her plans were foiled when local Nabatean tribes torched the vessels, cutting off her escape. As Octavian's army approached from Syria, with another force advancing from Cyrenaica, Cleopatra sent a final plea. She would abdicate in favor of her children if Egypt were spared. Octavian gave no response. On July 29th, 30 BCE, Imhotep, the high priest of Ptah, died at just 16 years old. Whether due to natural weakness or political execution, his death marked the symbolic end of a 3-century line that had preserved Egypt's sacred heritage. Just 3 days later, on August 1st, Egypt fell to Rome. As Octavian's legions marched on Alexandria by both land and sea, Antony led his remaining troops into the city for a final stand. But exhausted from years of war, his forces were swiftly crushed. As Octavian entered Alexandria, Cleopatra retreated to her fortified mausoleum treasury in the royal quarter. What followed has become legend. Believing that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, Antony stabbed himself. At her urgent request, his dying body was lifted into her chamber, where he passed away in her arms. Soon after, Cleopatra was deceived into leaving her sanctuary and was immediately taken into custody at the royal palace. Just 10 more golden sunsets passed over Alexandria before, on August 12th, Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, followed her Roman lover into death. Her life, though relatively brief, had been marked by intense upheaval. She had witnessed one sister deposed and executed, and another led in chains through Rome as a war prize. Faced with the options of execution or lifelong captivity, Ending her own life must have seemed the most dignified choice. Whether by an ASP concealed in a basket of figs or a poisoned hairpin, the exact means remains a mystery. Cleopatra passed into history, but her legacy endured. 400 years later, worshippers were still tending to her image in Roman shrines. 2 millennia on, her story and romances continue to fascinate the Western imagination. Her presence still lingers. So does the world she came from. In the years since her death, the Nile Valley has become a battleground for Romans, Arabs, Christians, and Muslims. Time and the blazing Egyptian sun have faded the once vibrant temples to sun-washed ruins. Tombs have been looted, pyramids stripped of their gleaming tops. Yet the mystique of pharaonic Egypt, immortalized through its last queen, has proven remarkably enduring. Among Cleopatra's physical legacies, the Temple of Hathor at Unit stands as her most grandiose architectural contribution. From its colonnaded front, the gentle face of the goddess, half woman, half cow, still gazes out in timeless guardianship, just as it did when it watched over depictions of Narmer, Egypt's first pharaoh. The symbols and ideology of divine kingship, perhaps the Egyptians' greatest invention, remained intact at the end as they had been at the dawn. As the final bearer of this ancient lineage, Cleopatra's deepest desire was to secure her dynasty's future. On the rear wall of the temple, she is shown beside her son, Ptolemy 15 Caesar, making offerings to the gods, mirroring the royal rituals performed by generations of her ancestors. In her vision, she stood as Isis Hathor, the divine mother. He was Horus, destined to avenge his fallen father and reign over Egypt in majesty. But like many of Cleopatra's ambitions, destiny had other plans. Caesar was executed by Octavian only days after Alexandria's collapse. The Ptolemaic line ended with him, along with the age of the pharaohs. Still, inscribed alongside this final image of divine kingship, the stonework of Cleopatra's temple carries a deeper, more lasting message. Carved next to the figure of her son are 4 simple hieroglyphs: a sandal strap, a snake, a loaf, and a stretch of fertile land. These symbols encapsulate the essence of ancient Egypt and form a phrase bestowed upon kings throughout history: Ankh Jet, living forever. It is a fitting farewell, not just to Cleopatra, but to the civilization she represented. Cleopatra's death handed Egypt over to Roman control, just as she had feared. With her passing, the long-standing tradition of pharaonic independence, spanning 3 millennia, came to an irreversible end. Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire as the personal possession of its ruler, to be exploited at will. For the next 4 centuries, Augustus and the emperors who followed capitalized on Egypt's legendary riches for their own benefit. Grain from Alexandria sustained Rome's enormous population. Gold from the eastern desert replenished the imperial treasury. Massive stone blocks from the Red Sea Mountains were shipped to embellish Roman public buildings. And the remote quarry at Mons Porphyrites supplied Rome's elite artisans with prized purple porphyry. However, Egypt's value to Rome went beyond just natural resources. With access to both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, the country became a vital hub for Roman trade, particularly with India, the origin of the exotic goods so favored by Rome's elite. Egypt's geographic position at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, Europe, and Arabia had once been the foundation of its wealth and strength as an independent kingdom. That same strategic location now ensured its domination by successive foreign powers. Rome, Byzantium, and Persia, later the Caliphs, Ottomans, and British, all regarded Egypt as an unmatched center of trade and a source of wealth ripe for exploitation. Yet even amid centuries of conquest and extraction, there was an unexpected benefit. In the late 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte launched an expedition to Egypt, intending to seize it as a French colony, control key trade routes, and weaken Britain's grip on India. While the campaign is remembered for its strategic ambitions, its lasting legacy was something quite different: the birth of Egyptology. Though Bonaparte himself had little personal interest in uncovering Egypt's ancient past, he brought with him over 150 scholars when he departed from Toulon on May 20th, 1798. Their careful studies and observations, later published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte, laid the groundwork for the modern scientific study of ancient Egyptian civilization. Today, those scholars are celebrated as pioneers of Egyptology. But at the time, they were overshadowed by the thousands of soldiers and cavalrymen who accompanied them to the Nile. Of all the intellectuals on the expedition, the surveyors held the most strategic importance. Their mission was to assess whether a canal could be built between the Mediterranean and the Gulf of Suez. For Bonaparte, gaining military and commercial leverage far outweighed the pursuit of historical knowledge. And while the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson dealt a significant blow to the French at the Battle of the Nile, evoking memories of Egypt's own ancient naval clashes with the Sea Peoples, France's vision ultimately prevailed. The modern Suez Canal, a successor to Darius I's ancient engineering feat, was completed in 1869, transforming global trade forever. The echoes between Egypt's ancient legacy and its modern history extended well into the 20th century. Much like Napoleon before them, the expansionist ambitions of the Third Reich led Nazi Germany to target Egypt as a strategic prize, this time to control the vital oil trade routes of the Middle East. Axis armor divisions pushed toward the eastern Nile Delta, retracing paths once used by invading Libyan forces during Egypt's late New Kingdom era. The Allied victories at El Alamein in July and October of 1942 marked a decisive moment in World War II. Winston Churchill famously declared it the end of the beginning. Strikingly, just 14 years later, the Suez Crisis, yet another military clash centered on Egyptian territory, marked the beginning of the British Empire's unraveling. From the conflicts of antiquity to Cold War tensions and beyond, Egypt has remained at the crossroads of global power. As one might reflect, if only humanity could learn from history the wisdom it might reveal. In addition to its geopolitical relevance, Egypt's profound cultural influence has resonated for centuries. Since the days when Caesar journeyed up the Nile with Cleopatra, Egypt's spiritual legacy has traveled far beyond its borders. Along with more tangible exports, the cult of Isis spread across the Roman Empire, reaching as far as Britain's distant shores. Its influence was both widespread and enduring, particularly in the Near East, Egypt's historical sphere of influence. Despite Emperor Justinian's decree banning pagan religions in 553 AD, the rich traditions of ancient Egyptian worship continued to shape the development of early Christianity. The imagery of Isis nursing Horus would soon be mirrored in depictions of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The visual symbolism and theological ideas remained strikingly familiar. On a subconscious level, Pharaonic culture has captivated the Western imagination since Roman times. From the Egyptian-inspired motifs at Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli to the frescoes of Pompeii, and in modern times through Art Deco jewelry and the glitzy Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, ancient Egypt has remained a source of artistic and architectural inspiration. Various individuals and ideological movements have also found meaning in Egypt's past. Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh, has been variously claimed as an icon by Freudian psychoanalysts, Protestant reformers, fascists, Afrocentrists, New Age thinkers, and advocates for LGBTQ+ rights. Hollywood, too, has long been enchanted by Egypt's exotic mystique and ancient allure, producing a string of blockbuster films, from the Ten Commandments and Cleopatra to Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Scorpion King. In essence, despite successive transformations, from Roman rule and the rise of Christianity to the Arab conquest and the upheavals of modernity, ancient Egypt as a symbol and idea has not only endured but flourished. The pharaohs and their subjects forged a civilization of extraordinary resilience and cultural power, one that continues to enchant and inspire everyone from world conquerors to mystery writers. In art, literature, architecture, tourism, and popular culture, the the spirit of ancient Egypt remains vibrantly alive in the global imagination. The people of the Nile Valley could hardly have hoped for a more lasting legacy. The Assyrians were not the kind to easily allow a hard-won province to slip from their grasp. After mounting 2 campaigns to secure control over Egypt, Ashurbanipal must have been frustrated by the rising power of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. Yet Psamtik first managed to break free from Assyrian rule without provoking much of a reaction from Nineveh. This lack of response stemmed from a more pressing concern closer to home. In southern Mesopotamia, right under the Assyrian gaze, Babylonia was once again gaining strength. Within months of Ashurbanipal's death, a dynamic new ruler ascended the Babylonian throne and began reclaiming territories lost to Assyria 2 generations prior. Swallowing its pride, Assyria chose to ally with its former vassal, State Egypt, to counter this emerging threat. At first, the alliance proved remarkably effective. Psamtik first supported Assyria in its Near Eastern campaigns, pushing back Babylonian advances as far as Carchemish on the Euphrates River, the first time an Egyptian army had ventured that far since Ramesses II. For a moment, Babylonia's progress seemed to halt. However, history was turning against the overstretched Assyrian Empire. Despite Egyptian support, Assyria suffered a crushing defeat in 609 and was fully annexed by Babylonia the following year. Now fighting to defend its interests, Egypt returned to Carchemish in 605 and launched a bold offensive against the Babylonian forces. The effort failed disastrously, with the Egyptian army decisively defeated. Egypt lost its final holdings in the region, and one by one, its allies fell to Babylon's power. Tyre was the first to fall, followed by Jerusalem. The pharaoh's partners were swept away by the unstoppable momentum of the Babylonian war machine. By 586, even with multiple courageous uprisings, the independent states of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine had been erased from existence. Judah was conquered, and its population exiled to Babylon, where they lamented their displacement. At this point, Egypt stood as the last barrier. Psamtik's second successor, Wahibra, reigned 589 to 570, successfully repelled a Babylonian invasion attempt in 582, but he was fully aware that alliances were essential to preserve Egypt's sovereignty. Following in his father's footsteps, he turned to the Greek world and placed Ionian and Carian mercenaries in prominent positions within the Egyptian military. These foreign troops had served honorably under Psamtik I and II and were expected to do so again in defense of Egypt's independence. Although this decision was necessary, it stirred deep resentment among the native Egyptian soldiers, who felt increasingly sidelined by the high-ranking foreigners in their ranks. The breaking point came in January 570, when a failed military expedition in Libya triggered a widespread mutiny among the surviving Egyptian troops. Wahibra dispatched one of his most seasoned generals, Ahmose, to quell the rebellion. Instead of restoring order, Ahmose took command of the revolt and was declared king by the insurrectionists. Turning his forces back toward Egypt, he marched on the royal city of Sais, captured it, and forced Wahibra to take refuge in his heavily fortified palace in Memphis. By August, Ahmose had been acknowledged as pharaoh across the western Nile Delta. In October, after a tense standoff during the summer heat, Wahibra attempted to retake his throne by attacking Sais. Ahmose's forces met the loyalists in battle and crushed them completely. Wahibra managed to escape and fled abroad to the court of Babylon. The Babylonian king, Nebuchadrezzar, saw this as a golden opportunity. Hosting the ousted pharaoh presented a perfect chance to interfere in Egypt's internal affairs and possibly install a Babylonian puppet on the throne of Horus. Recognizing the imminent threat, Ahmose II swiftly took action to prepare for a possible invasion. He forged an alliance with the Greeks of Cyrene, a coastal settlement in Libya established by colonists in the 7th century. At the same time, he dismissed a Greek garrison stationed in the eastern Nile Delta, suspecting its loyalty to the deposed Wahibra. In this context, practicality outweighed ideology. In 567, a Babylonian expedition, led by Wahibra, attempted to penetrate Egypt by both land and sea, but the invading force was decisively crushed. This time, Wahibra did not escape his fate. He was captured and executed. Despite the disgrace that marked his final years, Ahmose ensured that he was laid to rest with full royal honors. Aware of the power of public perception, the victorious king maintained a reputation as a man of the people, often appearing in satirical tales as a relatable and down-to-earth figure, yet presented himself in public as a devout and rightful sovereign. Those in the military who had supported Ahmose II's rise to the throne in hopes of reversing Egypt's pro-Greek orientation were soon disappointed. As part of his firm opposition to Babylon, Ahmose deepened Egypt's ties with the Greek world. Since recovering from the turmoil of the Sea Peoples, Greece had been repopulated during the 9th century and was now a patchwork of independent city-states, expanding their influence through colonies along the Mediterranean and Black Sea shores. These cities, which relied heavily on open commerce, viewed Babylon's territorial ambitions as a direct threat to their economic interests. Beyond diplomatic alignment, Egypt had strategic reasons for strengthening bonds with the Greeks. Aegean mercenaries were highly sought after across the Near East for their reputation in combat. The pharaoh extended lavish offerings to Greek religious sites, most notably contributing generously to the restoration of Delphi after it was devastated by fire, and even took a Greek princess as his wife. But his most significant move focused on Greek merchants operating within Egypt. Since the era of Psamtik I, settlers from Ionia had established themselves in the Delta. Many who once served as mercenaries had turned to trade, accumulating wealth through a flourishing import-export network that brought in goods like olive oil, wine, and especially silver from Greece in exchange for Egyptian grain. The scale and profitability of this trade were too great for the Egyptian state to ignore. Ahmose II sought to harness this economic activity by introducing a regulation disguised as a privilege. He designated Naucratis, located just 10 miles from his capital at Sais, as the exclusive trading center for Greek merchants. This allowed him to oversee and benefit from foreign trade under the appearance of supporting free commerce, reinforcing both his political image and economic control. Thanks to royal support and official protection, Naucratis quickly rose to become Egypt's most active port. It soon evolved into a remarkably diverse and cosmopolitan city, where Cypriots and Phoenicians mingled freely with Greeks from Miletus, Samos, and Chios. Several Greek communities established their own places of worship. The Chians dedicated theirs to Aphrodite, while the Samians honored Hera. Additionally, a shared sanctuary known as the Hellenion was created, allowing Greeks of various origins to gather and offer devotion to the collective pantheon of their homeland. Yet, beyond its religious devotion, the city had a more hedonistic side. Naucratis became famous across the Greek world for the beauty and permissiveness of its women. According to Herodotus, it was a fine place to find lovely courtesans. One infamous prostitute even gained her freedom through the generosity of Sappho's brother, though his motives may not have been entirely selfless. By the mid-6th century, Egypt, under the clever and strategic leadership of Ahmose, was undergoing a period of renewal. The country enjoyed domestic prosperity and stability, while earning respect and recognition on the international stage. Egypt had successfully resisted first the Assyrian and then the Babylonian empires, and had secured its status as a significant force in the complex landscape of global diplomacy. The nation itself had transformed, becoming more ethnically diverse and culturally varied than ever before. Yet Egypt had long served as a crossroads of civilizations and a haven for newcomers, and it had always managed to integrate them into its fabric. Time and again, pharaonic culture emerged stronger and more resilient. It was believed that the gods had destined Egypt to endure and prevail, and many Egyptians clung to that conviction with unwavering faith. The rulers of Sais, a city in Egypt's western delta, were among the most resilient figures in ancient Egyptian history. Over the course of 200 years, they maneuvered through alliances and power struggles to assert dominance, not only in Lower Egypt, their home territory, but across the entire Nile Valley. Their rise began in 728 BCE with Tefnakht, the Prince of the West, whose defiance against a rival Nubian dynasty set the tone for the Saite's independence. For 70 years, they resisted Kushite influence, refusing to submit. Later, they shrewdly leveraged Assyrian protection to expand their influence in the Delta. Eventually, they broke free from their status as vassals and seized control of a unified Egypt. Once in power, the Saite dynasty proved just as adept, aligning with the Assyrians to hold back the common threat from Babylonia. They honored native Egyptian deities while securing the loyalty of Greek mercenaries. Through these strategies, the Ptolemaic Dynasty preserved Egypt's sovereignty in an increasingly unpredictable world. Yet even the Saites had their limits. Within 10 years of fending off a Babylonian invasion, a far more determined and unstoppable enemy emerged, seemingly from nowhere. In 559 BCE, a young and ambitious leader named Qurash, better known as Cyrus, ascended the throne of Persia, then merely a subordinate state under the powerful Medes. Unwilling to remain under their control, Cyrus rebelled, overthrew the Median ruler, and took the empire for himself. At the time, the Egyptian pharaoh paid little attention. The conflict appeared distant and irrelevant, a foreign struggle in a remote land between unknown peoples. But Egypt's indifference would soon prove costly. In less than 20 years, Cyrus had conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, followed by Babylonia, establishing himself as the supreme ruler of an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the peaks of the Hindu Kush. Seemingly overnight, a new and terrifying superpower had emerged, hungry for further conquest. Faced with this growing threat, all Ahmose II could do was continue recruiting Greek mercenaries, strengthen his navy, and brace for what might come. When Cyrus died in 530 BCE during a campaign against the fierce Scythian nomads of Central Asia, it offered a brief flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly extinguished by events within Egypt itself. Ahmose II, a seasoned military leader, had successfully defended Egypt for 40 years. His death in 526 marked a turning point. His successor, Psamtik III, was young, inexperienced, and untested. The passing of a monarch had always been a precarious time, but with a hostile force looming nearby, it became a critical vulnerability. Cambyses, Cyrus's successor and the new king of Persia, recognized the opportunity and acted swiftly. Within weeks of hearing of Ahmose's death, he launched a campaign toward the Nile Delta. In 525 BCE, Persian troops invaded Egypt, captured Memphis, executed Psamtik III, and absorbed the two lands into the expanding Persian Empire. Cambyses wasted no time in establishing Persian-style governance over his newly conquered territory. One of his first acts was to abolish the office of the god's wife of Ammonius, denying Ahmose's daughter her rightful succession and removing the long-serving Ankh-Nesneferibra from the role, a position she had held for an extraordinary 60 years. From that point forward, no such religious office would exist to act as a symbol of native pride in Upper Egypt. However, not all Egyptians viewed the Persian conquest as a catastrophe. Some officials adapted swiftly and willingly to the new regime. Among them was Cnemomeibra, the overseer of works. Descended from a prestigious family of architects that traced its lineage back to the reign of Ramesses II, Cnemomeibra bore a name honoring Ahmose II, just like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He had served the Saite king faithfully in the quarries of Wadi Hammamat. But despite his overt loyalty to the former dynasty, Cnemomeibra showed no hesitation in accepting the rule of Persia. Not only did he survive the regime change, he thrived under it. His loyalty was rewarded with several high-paying priestly positions. For individuals like Cnemomeibra, self-interest and career advancement outweighed patriotic sentiment. Others, though perhaps more idealistic, saw cooperation with the Persians as a way to preserve Egyptian identity. For the elite class, religion remained the heart of their values and cultural heritage. Demonstrating devotion to local deities and supporting temple life were essential to gaining respect in their communities. Faced with foreign conquerors who honored unfamiliar gods, some Egyptians chose not to resist, but instead to influence their new rulers, to teach them the Egyptian way of life. One man from Sais, Egypt's proudest delta city, succeeded in doing exactly that. His name was Wejahorosnet, and he was perfectly suited for the task. His father had been a priest at the local temple, and Wejahorosnet himself was deeply devoted to the goddess Neith. Like many saints before him, he had entered military service and risen to the rank of admiral under Ahmose II. He had likely fought naval battles against the invading Persian forces. Wejahorosnet later referred to the conquest as a great disaster unlike anything the land had ever seen. Yet within months of Cambyses' victory, Wejahorosnet had ingratiated himself with the Persian king, rising to the rank of senior courtier and earning the prestigious role of chief physician, granting him close access to the royal court. In public, he embraced the new regime completely, and with no sign of hesitation, praised the Persian conquest in glowing terms, declaring Cambyses to be the great ruler not only of Egypt but of all foreign lands. But Wejahorosnet's actions went beyond mere cooperation. With his deep knowledge of Egyptian traditions, he was uniquely positioned to influence the Persians and begin their gradual transformation into culturally legitimate rulers. A crucial part of this process was his authorship of Cambyses' royal titulary, an official Egyptian-style royal name. Through such initiatives, Wejahorosnet guided the Persians through a slow but deliberate process of Egyptianization, just as previous foreign dynasties, the Hyksos, Libyans, and Kushites, had undergone before them. Cambyses appeared to accept and support the process of cultural adaptation. Ruling over a vast and multilingual empire, he had little choice but to adopt an inclusive approach. Rather than imposing a rigid cultural agenda, he demonstrated a notable degree of tolerance toward the various customs and beliefs of the peoples under his rule. His predecessor, Cyrus, had freed the Jews from their Babylonian exile, and Cambyses continued in that spirit, extending protection to the substantial Jewish population living on the island of Abu in Egypt. Elsewhere in the Nile Valley, he willingly retained Egyptian officials in administrative roles, and for much of the population, especially those in the countryside, daily life remained largely unchanged. The only significant restructuring occurred within the military, where native Egyptian officers were replaced and their talents redirected, as was the case with Wejahorosnet. After losing his naval command, the former admiral focused his efforts on preserving and revitalizing his local temple. Leveraging his influential position at court, he worked to promote the cult of Neith in Sais. He first complained to Cambyses about the presence of foreigners who had violated the sanctity of the temple by taking residence within its sacred grounds. Wejahorosnet convinced the king to have them removed. Following continued advocacy, Cambyses agreed to purify the temple and restore its priests and offerings to the state they had enjoyed before the Persian conquest. As Wejahorosnet later explained, these actions were taken because he had helped the king understand the importance of Sais. To confirm his respect for local tradition, Cambyses personally visited the temple and bowed before the statue of Neith, performing the ritual gesture as every king does. Through such acts, the Persian ruler began to take on the identity of a true pharaoh in the eyes of his new subjects. Similar developments occurred throughout Egypt. In the delta city of Ptolemy, the influential Ramesses, who held the role of overseer of the royal harem, used his court position to benefit his community and its religious practices. It likely helped that the Persian monarchs felt a connection to the power of the local lion god Mahes. Still, it was the initiative and persistence of Egyptian officials in guiding and shaping their new rulers that played a critical role in shaping the First Persian period. In Memphis, the sacred Apis bull cult continued uninterrupted, and the priest in charge even claimed credit for influencing the conquerors. "I placed fear of you, Apis, in the hearts of all people and foreigners who were in Egypt." Although Egypt had lost its sovereignty, its people remained steadfast in preserving the cultural and religious traditions they held dear. In truth, the Persian conquest of Egypt was far from the great disaster some portrayed it to be. On the contrary, The new rulers injected much-needed energy and innovation into the administration of the Nile Valley, revitalizing its institutions and infrastructure. This period of renewal reached its peak during the reign of Darius I, Cambyses' successor. Darius took a special interest in Egypt's centers of learning, the houses of life attached to prominent temples. From his royal court in Susa, constructed by Egyptian artisans using exotic materials like Nubian ebony and ivory, he instructed Wejahorosnet, by then an aged and trusted court official, to return to Sais and restore its house of life, which had fallen into neglect. Possibly relying on temple records, Darius is credited with codifying Egypt's laws to provide a stable foundation for governance. He recognized Egypt not as a typical province, but as a land of exceptional wealth and cultural heritage. It held a unique status in his empire and was simply too valuable to mismanage or lose. As a result, the satrap station in Memphis had no authority over financial matters. Instead, economic affairs were overseen by a separate official, a chancellor, whose duties also included monitoring the satrap to ensure he did not become too assimilated. In fact, satraps were often summoned back to Persia to personally report on their conduct to the king. Generally, Darius governed Egypt with a light hand. Native Egyptians continued to serve in high positions. The tribute demanded was not excessive, and evidence from the period points to widespread prosperity, including in rural areas. Persian control was maintained through strong communication lines with the broader empire, a sophisticated intelligence network, and a ring of strategically placed garrisons. Fortified outposts stretched from Dorjanardi in Lower Nubia to the Sinai Desert, providing the means to suppress uprisings swiftly and effectively. In terms of economic development, Darius prioritized enhancing maritime trade between Egypt and the Persian Gulf. In Upper Egypt, the overland route through the Wadi Hammamat to the Red Sea coast was reopened and actively used by Persian expeditions. But in Lower Egypt, where no such direct path existed, a new solution was needed, one that led to one of ancient Egypt's most ambitious engineering feats, rivaling even the grandeur of the Giza pyramids. During the earlier Sate period, Pharaoh Nekau II had begun plans for a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. A century later, the Persians brought this vision to completion. Where the Sates had merely conceived the idea, the Persians made a reality. The result was a canal approximately 150 feet wide, stretching about 40 miles from the Nile's easternmost branch through the Wadi Tumulat, reaching the Bitter Lakes and continuing south to the Gulf of Suez. As ships made the 4-day journey along the canal, they passed by towering stelae of pink granite, strategically placed at key points along the route. Each monumental slab, standing 10 feet tall and 7 feet wide, was engraved with carefully chosen scenes and inscriptions that underscored Darius's authority over his vast empire. One side portrayed the king protected by his Persian deity, Ahura Mazda, accompanied by a cuneiform inscription. The other side featured the Egyptian symbol of unity, a winged sun disk, along with a hieroglyphic inscription praising the ruler. In traditional pharaonic style, the Egyptian side also included a frieze of 24 kneeling figures, each shown atop an oval ring inscribed with the name of a province in the empire. This type of imagery would have been instantly recognizable to any Egyptian familiar with the great temple reliefs, though with one striking detail. On Darius's stele, Egypt itself was counted among the subject lands, being listed alongside legendary regions like Persia, Media, Babylonia, Assyria, and even India was of little consolation. On the reverse of the monument, Darius made his claim clear: I, a Persian, along with Persians, conquered Egypt. I commanded the digging of a canal from the river in Egypt, the Nile by name, to the Bitter River, referring to the Red Sea. In 497 BCE, to mark the canal's official opening, the king attended in person, proudly observing as a fleet of 24 ships carrying Egyptian tribute slowly sailed eastward toward Persia. While the creation of the ancient Suez Canal stemmed from a drive to enhance maritime trade, Persian interest in controlling the trans-Saharan trade routes on Egypt's western flank led to another impressive engineering achievement. Karga, the southernmost of Egypt's four major oases, had long been a crucial hub in desert travel. A web of paths intersected there, connecting the Nile Valley to Nubia in the south and the territories beyond the Sahara to the west. Since the late Old Kingdom, Karga had not supported permanent settlement, as the increasingly arid climate and lack of rainfall had made habitation nearly impossible. True to their resourceful nature, the Persians introduced two transformative solutions. First, they brought camels into Egypt from their Bactrian and Arabian provinces. These animals revolutionized desert transport, allowing caravans to journey far longer without needing frequent water sources. Second, the Persians developed a remarkable method for extracting water from the sandstone aquifers deep beneath the surface. They carved extensive underground rock-cut galleries throughout Karga, functioning as hidden aqueducts that delivered fresh artesian water to irrigate fields and gardens above ground. This technological breakthrough turned vast stretches of arid land into productive farmland, capable of yielding cereals, fruits, vegetables, and cotton, a crop introduced by the Persians. Around these subterranean water systems, new villages and towns began to emerge, complete with temples and administrative buildings. Due to their remote location far from the Nile, papyrus was rare and expensive, so residents wrote on pottery shards instead. This practice has left behind an exceptional archive that offers a vivid glimpse into everyday life in this distant corner of the Persian Empire. As expected, both individuals and institutions safeguarded their most important documents. In addition to personal notes, household accounts, and routine records, legal contracts appear frequently. These records reveal that water, not land, was the true foundation of wealth in Karga. Rights to the water flowing from each aqueduct were meticulously divided into days and fractions of days, which could be bought, sold, leased, or used to secure loans. In this desert economy, water was, in every sense, currency. Coinage was present as well. By 410 BCE, Athenian silver staters had become the standard form of money, reflecting the deepening influence of the Greek world on Egypt's economy. It was just one more sign of how culturally diverse Persian Egypt had become, a place where interfaith and intercultural marriages were common, where temple reliefs showed fantastical winged figures from Zoroastrian beliefs, and where children of Persian immigrants often adopted Egyptian names. In short, under the reign of Darius I, Egypt became a thriving crossroads of peoples and traditions, a land marked by cultural exchange, commercial vitality, and a spirit of tolerance. But this flourishing chapter would not last forever. Darius's successors displayed significantly less interest in their Egyptian province. They no longer even pretended to uphold the customs of Egyptian kingship or engage with its religious traditions. Economic activity began to wane, and political authority weakened as the Persian leadership turned its focus increasingly toward their volatile western territories and the ongoing conflicts involving Athens and Sparta. Within this context of administrative neglect and commercial decline, relations between Egyptians and their foreign rulers began to deteriorate. Just a year before Darius I passed away, the first rebellion erupted in the Delta. It would take his successor, Xerxes I, 2 years to restore order. In an attempt to prevent further uprisings, Xerxes removed Egyptians from positions of influence. But such actions did little to halt the growing instability. While Xerxes and his generals concentrated on their battles with the Greeks, most notably at Thermopylae and Salamis, ambitious provincial families throughout Lower Egypt began to dream of reclaiming power. Some even went so far as to adopt royal titles. After barely 50 years, Persian dominance in Egypt was beginning to fray. The assassination of Xerxes I in the summer of 465 BCE provided both the opportunity and the catalyst for a second major revolt. This time, the rebellion was led by Iretharu, a compelling figure from Sais, continuing his family's legacy of resistance. Unlike the earlier revolt, this one proved much harder to suppress. Within a year, Arethureru had won support throughout the Delta and beyond. Even government scribes in Kurga Oasis dated official contracts by referencing Year 2 of Arethureru, Prince of the Rebels. Only in Egypt's far southeast, such as in the Wadi Hammamat quarries, did local officials remain loyal to Persian authority. Recognizing the widespread support for his cause, Arethureru reached out to the Persians' archrival, Athens, seeking military assistance. Still resentful over the destruction of their sacred temples by Xerxes' forces decades earlier, the Athenians were eager to intervene. They sent a war fleet to Egypt, and the combined Egyptian and Greek forces managed to push the Persian army back to their stronghold in Memphis, effectively besieging them there for months. But the Persians were determined not to lose one of their most valuable provinces. Eventually, through sheer numbers and relentless pressure, they managed to break out of Memphis and slowly reconquer the country, region by region. After nearly 10 years of resistance, Arethureru was finally captured and executed by crucifixion, serving as a stark warning to future rebels. Despite the brutal suppression, the Egyptian appetite for freedom had been reignited. Not long after, another rebellion flared up, once again led by figures from Sais and again with Athenian backing. Only the peace treaty of 449 BCE between Persia and Athens temporarily ended Greek involvement in Egypt's internal conflicts, restoring trade and travel between the two Mediterranean powers. Yet the unrest within Egypt did not simply disappear. The country remained simmering with dissatisfaction, and the possibility of another full-scale uprising loomed large. In 410 BCE, civil unrest erupted across Egypt, plunging parts of the country into near anarchy and sparking violent clashes, especially in the deep south. On the island of Abu, the Egyptian priests of Khnum incited a mob to attack the neighboring Jewish temple dedicated to Yahweh. Although the attackers were later apprehended and imprisoned, the incident underscored the growing turmoil and instability within Egyptian society. In the Delta region, a new wave of local leaders emerged, determined to reclaim independence. Among them was Psamtik-Amenertis of Sais, grandson of the rebel leader from 4 decades earlier. Bearing both his grandfather's name and that of the founder of the Sate dynasty, he was resolute in his mission to revive his family's legacy. Employing guerrilla tactics and using his intimate knowledge of the Delta's terrain, he launched a persistent campaign against the Persian authorities. For 6 years, this resistance movement wore down the occupying forces, proving that even a global empire could struggle to suppress a grassroots rebellion supported by the local populace. The critical turning point came in 404 BCE. Just as Cambyses had exploited the death of Egypt's pharaoh to conquer the land in 525 BCE, the Egyptians seized a similar opportunity. Upon hearing of the death of Darius II, Amenertis declared himself king. Though symbolic at first, the declaration rallied widespread support. By the end of 402 BCE, his kingship was acknowledged from the Mediterranean coast to the first cataract of the Nile. While some provincial officials continued to record dates using the regnal years of Artaxerxes II, likely to hedge their loyalties, the Persian Empire faced its own distractions. A planned invasion force, gathered in Phoenicia to retake Egypt, was instead redirected to address a revolt in Cyprus. With the threat of a Persian assault temporarily lifted, one might have expected Amenertis to welcome the Cypriot admiral who fled to Egypt. However, in a typical display of Sate political maneuvering, he ordered the admiral's assassination, betraying rather than aiding a fellow rebel. Despite his cunning, Amenertis's reign was short-lived. His rise to power, achieved through manipulation and violence, diminished the aura of divine legitimacy traditionally surrounding the pharaoh's role. Instead, the throne was exposed for what it truly had become, the ultimate political prize. Other powerful families in the Delta took notice. In October 399 BCE, a rival leader from the city of Jedet launched his own coup, overthrowing Amenertis and establishing a new ruling line. To signify the birth of this fresh dynasty, Nefertiti of Jedet deliberately adopted the Horus name once held by Psamtik I, who had famously liberated Egypt from foreign domination. Yet the similarities ended there. Always mindful of a potential Persian retaliation, Nefertiti's reign, spanning from 399 to 393 BC, was defined by a frenzy of defensive preparations. His key diplomatic move was to forge an alliance with Sparta, sending supplies of grain and timber to support King Agesilaos in his campaign against the Persian Empire. In 393 BCE, when Nefertiti's son Hagar ascended the throne, it marked the first time in 5 generations that a native-born Egyptian had inherited kingship from his father. Despite bearing a name that meant the Arab, Hagar identified strongly with his Egyptian heritage and was determined to uphold the traditional duties of a pharaoh. Early in his reign, he favored the title, "He who satisfies the gods," reflecting his commitment to religious devotion. But reverence alone was not enough to ensure political stability. After scarcely a year in power, Hagar became the latest victim of internal strife among Egypt's elite families. A rival seized both his throne and his dynasty's monuments, continuing the relentless cycle of political upheaval. Within another year, however, Hagar managed to reclaim the crown and declared his renewed appearance as king. Still, the proclamation rang hollow. The institution of the monarchy had reached a historic low, stripped of dignity, authority, and the aura it once held. Though Hagar held on for another 10 years, his ineffective son, the second Nefertiti, remained in power for only 16 weeks before a military commander from Jebnejer usurped the throne. This marked the third change of dynasty in the Delta in just 20 years. Yet Nakhtembef, who reigned from 380 to 362 BCE, proved to be cut from a different cloth than his predecessors. Having witnessed firsthand the devastation caused by rival warlords, including what he termed the disaster of the previous king, he understood the fragility of the throne more than most. As a military leader, he recognized that real power required a solid base of armed strength. With Egypt constantly under threat of Persian invasion, his top priority was to be a mighty king who guards Egypt, a copper wall that protects the land. Still, he understood that physical strength alone would not be enough. Egyptian kingship had always carried a symbolic weight, functioning as much through psychological influence as through military might. To reinforce his image, Nakhtembef referred to himself as the ruler who cuts out the hearts of traitors. Restoring the monarchy's prestige required projecting a strong and traditional image to the people. Alongside the usual political strategies, such as appointing close family members and loyal allies to key government positions, Nakhtembef launched the most ambitious temple construction program Egypt had seen in 8 centuries. He aimed to leave no doubt that he was a pharaoh in the old, revered style. One of his first royal acts was to allocate 1/10 of the revenues collected at Naucratis, from import duties and local taxes, to the Temple of Neith at Sais. This move served a dual purpose. It appeased his state rivals while enhancing his own image as a devout ruler. Other significant donations followed, including generous support for the Temple of Horus at Edfu. As the living embodiment of Horus on earth, Nakhtembef saw it as fitting that he should support his divine counterpart's main sanctuary. Nakhtembef's efforts weren't just about spiritual merit. He also understood that Egypt's temples controlled vast economic resources, including farmland, mining operations, craft production, and trade routes. Investing in the temples was a practical way to stimulate the economy. A thriving economy, in turn, meant more surplus wealth, resources that could be used to fund Egypt's defenses, particularly the recruitment of Greek mercenaries. In this way, bolstering both the priesthood and the military went hand in hand. Yet maintaining that balance was delicate. If the temples were pressed too hard for resources, resentment could grow, threatening the very stability Nakhtembef sought to protect. As a thoughtful observer of his nation's past, Nakhtembef sought to prevent a repeat of the dynastic conflicts that had plagued Egypt in recent decades. To ensure a smooth succession, he revived the ancient practice of co-regency, appointing his son Jeter as joint ruler. However, The biggest threat to Jeter's reign would not come from domestic rivals, but from his own reckless approach to governance, both at home and abroad. Unlike his cautious father, Jeter opened his reign with an ambitious and ill-conceived campaign to wrest control of Palestine and Phoenicia from Persian hands. Whether driven by dreams of restoring Egypt's imperial past or seeking to justify his family's continued rule, the decision was both bold and unwise. Though the Persian Empire was dealing with internal unrest in Asia Minor, it was unlikely to surrender such vital territories without a fight. Moreover, the massive resources required for such a military expedition placed unsustainable pressure on Egypt's still recovering economy. In desperate need of silver to fund the hiring of Greek mercenaries, Jeter turned to Egypt's temples as a source of wealth. Convinced that taxing religious institutions was the easiest way to fill the treasury, he imposed a series of deeply unpopular levies: a tax on buildings, a poll tax, commodity purchase taxes, increased shipping duties, and finally, the confiscation of temple assets. To make matters worse, the mercenaries funded by these harsh measures, a force of 1,000 Spartan hoplites and 30 military advisors, arrived under the command of none other than Agesilaos, a former ally of Egypt. At 84, he was not interested in a subordinate role and demanded full command of the military. Jeter was forced to sideline another trusted Greek commander, Chabrias of Athens, who had originally been brought in by Hagar during the 380s to manage Egypt's defense. Chabrias was reassigned to lead the navy, while Agesilaos took charge of the land forces. But placing three powerful and proud leaders at the top created tension and instability from the very beginning. With public resentment mounting over the new taxes, mistrust and discord overshadowed the military campaign. One of the most vivid records of this disastrous campaign comes from an eyewitness, a healer named Winifred from the Central Delta. Born near the royal city of Tjebnecher, Winifred was exactly the kind of loyal subject favored by Nakhnebef's regime. Trained in the local temple, he specialized in healing and magic, skills that eventually brought him to Jeter's attention. When the campaign against Persia was launched, Winifred was appointed to keep the official military journal, a role of great significance in a culture where words carried magical power. Yet almost immediately, trouble arose. As the army began its march into Asia, a letter reached the regent in Memphis accusing Winifred of treason. He was arrested, bound in copper shackles, and sent back to Egypt for interrogation. But Winifred, like many skilled officials of his era, knew how to navigate political danger. Through clever maneuvering, he not only escaped punishment but earned the regent's trust and favor. He was granted official protection and rewarded with generous gifts. Meanwhile, before a single battle had been fought, most of Jeter's army abandoned him in favor of a charismatic young officer, none other than his own nephew, Prince Nakhtarheb, the son of the Memphis regent. Agesilaos eagerly supported the prince's claim and escorted him back to Egypt in triumph. After defeating a rival claimant, Nakhtarheb was installed as pharaoh. For his support, Agesilaos received 230 silver talents, a sum large enough to fund 5,000 mercenaries for a year, before returning to Sparta. Jeter, humiliated and abandoned, had no choice but to flee into Persian territory, the very enemy he had sought to challenge. Winifred was quickly dispatched with a naval force to pursue the former king. Eventually, Jeter was found in Susa, where the Persians, having no desire to harbor him, handed him over. He was brought back to Egypt in chains, and Winifred was once again showered with honors. In a time of political upheaval, loyalty to the prevailing power was the surest path to reward. Egypt's ongoing power struggle with the vast Persian Empire during the 4th century not only shaped its domestic and international strategies, but also deeply influenced its national mindset. The constant threat of reconquest and the need to remain ever alert for invasion caused the country to turn inward, searching for stability and reassurance. In a world marked by shifting global dynamics and uncertainty, the Egyptians increasingly clung to the traditions and values that distinguished them from other cultures. Of all these traditions, Religion stood out as the most enduring and unique hallmark of pharaonic civilization. Though viewed with contempt by the Greeks and with curious detachment by the Persians, Egypt's multitude of animal deities represented the highest ideals of native belief. These gods symbolized timeless, unchanging forces that offered the promise of salvation amidst the unpredictability of everyday life. Animal cults had long been a part of Egyptian spiritual life. Animals were interred in ritual enclosures as early as the pre-dynastic period, and the Apis bull had been venerated at Memphis since the earliest days of the Egyptian state. However, it was during the brief period of regained independence from Persian domination that these cults truly flourished, reaching levels of popularity and ritual elaboration previously unseen. This surge gave rise to some of the most curious religious practices ever recorded in Egypt. By the mid-4th century BCE, animal cults had become widespread across the land. In Bast, sacred cats were revered. In Thebes, it was dogs and gazelles. At Unit, bulls. At Shedet, crocodiles. And in Jedet, even certain species of fish were worshipped. Each cult operated its own temple and was served by a dedicated priesthood. Because temple workers rotated in and out of service, a large segment of the population benefited from the wealth generated by these religious institutions, making it a truly nationwide phenomenon. One of the most significant centers of animal worship was Saqqara, the ancient necropolis for Egypt's nobility and kings. By the time of Nekhtarheb's reign, the underground tombs of Egypt's elite were accompanied by an entire zoo's worth of sacred creatures. Among the most venerated sites at Saqqara was the Serapeum, a sprawling complex of temples and workshops built above a vast underground burial chamber for the Apis bulls. Not far away stood another elaborate structure dedicated to the worship of the mother of Apis, a sacred cow believed to be the earthly embodiment of the goddess Isis. Upon death, each of these cows underwent a meticulous ritual. They were purified, embalmed, dressed in linen wrappings, and adorned with amulets before being laid to rest in specially carved underground vaults. Excavating these burial chambers from solid rock could take up to 2 years, and the massive stone sarcophagi created for each sacred cow required a team of 30 laborers to maneuver into place. For 10 days of this intense effort, the workers might receive a full month's wages, testimony to the importance and grandeur of the cult. Beyond the burial chambers dedicated to the sacred bulls and their mothers, an extensive network of underground passageways housed the remains of mummified baboons. These animals, primarily transported by river or sea from regions south of the Sahara, since only a small number could be bred in captivity, were kept within a designated enclosure at the Temple of Ptah in Memphis. There, they were venerated as earthly manifestations of Thoth, the god of wisdom, and as symbols of the hearing ear, believed to mediate between mortals and the divine. In this way, animals served as the saints of ancient Egyptian religion. After death, each baboon was sanctified as an incarnation of Osiris and interred in a rectangular wooden coffin, which was placed into a niche carved into the rock walls of the catacombs. These niches were sealed with limestone slabs inscribed with the baboon's name, its place of origin, and a devotional message. One such inscription read, "May you be praised before Osiris. O you Osiris, Mars the baboon. He was brought from the south. His salvation took place, and he was placed in his coffin in the Temple of Ptah." Pilgrims traveled to Saqqara from across the country, hoping to receive guidance, healing, insight into future events, or even favorable outcomes in legal disputes. They offered gifts or paid for the burial of a sacred animal, believing that Osiris the baboon would deliver their pleas to the gods. The site bustled with dream interpreters, astrologers, seers, charm vendors, and magicians offering their services to the many faithful. Meanwhile, the priests and embalmers profited handsomely from this spiritual economy. They often used less costly, smaller monkeys in place of the rarer baboons, taking advantage of the fact that the wrapped mummies made it difficult for buyers to detect the substitution. Among the most expansive of Saqqara's animal necropolises were the ibis catacombs. Like baboons, Ibises were sacred to Thoth, and in the Egyptian pursuit of divine knowledge, they mummified and interred as many as 2 million of these birds at Saqqara alone. Each gallery, roughly 30 feet high and 30 feet wide, was packed from floor to ceiling with pottery jars, each containing either a full ibis mummy or selected body parts. To meet this extraordinary demand, ibises were raised on a large scale at Lake Abu Sur and other locations throughout Egypt. In Kmun, the primary center for Thoth's worship, massive areas were dedicated to feeding and tending the birds. Upon death, even the smallest remnants, feathers, nesting materials, eggshell fragments, were meticulously collected for ritual use. Priests would sometimes bury the carcasses temporarily to speed up decomposition, allowing easier separation of bones for individual burial items and, consequently, higher profits. Turpentine imported from Tyre was used to accelerate this process, though it often charred the bones within the wrappings. Still, by the time the damage was discovered, the pilgrim had long since departed. The final animal burial complex at Saqqara was reserved for falcons, sacred to the god Horus. Here, Egyptian creativity took yet another step forward. In addition to offering mummified falcons, devotees could purchase and donate bronze or stone statues of Horus. Each statue had a hollow base with a sliding panel, into which either a small offering, such as a bit of mummified shrew as food for the falcon god, or a written prayer on a papyrus scroll could be inserted. By combining petition and offering in one package, the worshipper hoped to ensure both were received together, increasing the likelihood of divine favor. As a solar deity, Horus naturally complemented Thoth, who was associated with the moon. This made ibises and falcons an ideal symbolic pairing. However, there was a more strategic reason behind the widespread appeal of the falcon cult at Saqqara. It was actively promoted and supported by the state. The government had little genuine interest in popular religious practices, but it was highly invested in reinforcing the ideology of kingship. According to ancient Egyptian belief, the king was the living embodiment of Horus. Furthermore, Nakhthar-Heb's very name meant Horus of Hebet is victorious, drawing an even tighter connection between the monarch and the falcon god. As a result, the cult of Nakhthar-Heb the falcon was cultivated alongside that of the sacred animal, to the point where the two became virtually indistinguishable. This was a deliberate effort to channel public devotion into support for the monarchy. From the outset of his reign, Nakhthar-Heb understood the power of religious symbolism and historical legacy in reinforcing his authority. One of his earliest commands to his loyal official Winifred was to revive the ancient mortuary cults of Snefru and Jedefre, pharaohs who had ruled during the pinnacle of the Pyramid Age. This move carried significant propaganda value, as it linked Egypt's current ruler with two legendary kings of its distant past. Outside of Memphis, Nakhthar-Heb launched an unprecedented wave of construction, rivaling even the building efforts of Ramesses II. Nearly every temple in Egypt saw some form of royal restoration or embellishment. Nakhthar-Heb was determined to be remembered not just as a military leader or opportunist, but as a legitimate pharaoh in the full sense of the title. Yet beneath this architectural enthusiasm lay a hint of anxiety. Much of his focus was on reinforcing gateways and perimeter walls, the areas most vulnerable to attack. It appeared that he was deeply committed to defending Egypt's sacred spaces from external threats. In this way, his religious activities mirrored his foreign policy, both aimed at shielding Egypt from its enemies. Meanwhile, the Persian Empire had never truly accepted the loss of Egypt, its wealthiest province. No number of temples, sacred burials, or royal rituals could distract them from their determination to reclaim the Nile Valley. In 373 BCE, Nakhtembef had successfully thwarted a Persian attempt to invade the delta. But 30 years later, his grandson Nakhthar-Heb was not so fortunate. The army of King Artaxerxes III captured the key coastal city of Pelusium with relative ease and continued its advance southward to Memphis. By late summer of 343 BCE, the capital had fallen, Egyptian resistance had collapsed, and independence was lost. Nakhthar-Heb, the last native-born Egyptian to rule the country without foreign challenge until modern times, fled into exile. Ultimately, his devout religiosity and political maneuvering were no match for the overwhelming power of the Persian military. Egypt's brief period of autonomy came to an end, and the country was once again absorbed as a satrapy within the vast Persian Empire, as if the last 70 years had never happened. Anyone alive during the Persian invasion of 343 who still remembered Cambyses' conquest nearly 2 centuries earlier would have been struck by a profound sense of history repeating itself. Yet for the majority of Egyptians who had grown used to a fragile sense of independence, this sudden reabsorption into foreign rule must have felt like a devastating blow. Across the country, particularly in the provinces, many chose to turn a blind eye to the latest upheaval. Instead, they quietly carried on with their lives, clinging to their native customs and traditions as a quiet form of resistance against their new foreign overlords. One poignant example of this quiet defiance was Ptolemy, a devout follower of Thoth living in Kman, the god's main sanctuary. Amid the noisy cries of sacred ibises being fed nearby, Ptolemy went about his temple duties with unwavering dedication, even as the country around him descended into chaos. He later reflected on this turbulent time. I served for 7 years as the overseer for this god, managing his estate faultlessly, while a foreign ruler held power in Egypt. Nothing remained in its proper place. Conflict had erupted throughout the land. The south was in disorder, the north in revolt. Temples stood empty of their priests, who had fled in confusion, unsure of what was unfolding. Egypt's deep-rooted faith in its traditions had long been its greatest asset. But in a world that was shifting rapidly, that very faith became a liability. What once upheld Egyptian civilization during the stable centuries of the 3rd and 2nd millennia could no longer shield it from the unpredictable pressures of emerging global powers. The country had lost its central role in world affairs and had become just one more rich prize in the struggles between younger, more dynamic empires. Ptolemy's quiet devotion, while admirable, was also symbolic of a broader national paralysis. Faced with unfamiliar challenges, most Egyptians preferred to look away, put their trust in the old gods, and maintain their rituals in the hope that life would somehow return to normal. The final flicker of Egypt's long-standing spirit of independence came late in 338 BCE. The catalyst was the death of yet another Persian ruler. While the court in Persepolis mourned the passing of Artaxerxes III and made preparations for his successor, a final, defiant Egyptian figure emerged to free the land. Very little is definitively known about Qababash, a man whose obscurity mirrored the desperate odds he faced. Possibly a native of Memphis, or at least closely connected to the city, Qababash quickly gained recognition there as a legitimate king. His call for liberation resonated far beyond the Delta. Even Thebes lent its support, signaling a rare moment of unity across the country. From Upper Egypt to the Mediterranean coast, a collective desire for freedom from Persian rule surged. Qababash was the nation's last hope. Understanding that any Persian retaliation would likely come via the sea, he moved swiftly to the key port of Perwajet. There, he navigated the marshlands and inspected every channel that led to the Great Green, the Mediterranean Sea, preparing to fend off the incoming fleet from Asia. Strategically, it was a sound plan. But even with the hopes of a nation resting on his shoulders, Qababash was no match for the Persian war machine at its most formidable. His revolt endured for less than 2 years. His ultimate fate remains unknown. In the end, Persia re-established control under a new ruler, Darius III, who reigned over Egypt from 336 to 332 BCE and over Persia until 331 BCE. Egypt's dream of independence, once again, came to a close. Egypt had never held greater importance for the Persian Empire. Its abundant resources were crucial for funding mercenary armies, which the empire now relied upon more than ever in its struggles. For 150 years, Persia had been locked in a prolonged conflict with the Greek world over dominance in the Aegean and Anatolia. Both Sparta and Athens had proven to be relentless adversaries, standing firm against Persian power and dealing humiliating blows through acts of courage and resistance. Now the focus had shifted northward toward the rugged kingdom of Macedon. This rising power had recently assumed the mantle of Pan-Hellenic leadership in opposition to Persian dominance. In the late summer of 336 BCE, just as Darius III was ascending the throne in Persepolis, the young Macedonian king Alexander III was gaining recognition throughout Greece as leader of the League of Corinth and as commander of the Persian campaign originally conceived by his father. The world stood at a decisive crossroads, though Darius could not have foreseen it. By the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander had crossed the Hellespont into the Persian-controlled west and begun his march southward to confront the empire's forces. The decisive encounter at the Granicos River in May marked the start of Persia's unraveling. Through the summer, Alexander continued his campaign through Anatolia, culminating in the siege of Halicarnassus. As autumn and winter unfolded, his army advanced along the coastline, meeting little resistance. Then, in November 333 BCE, a second major clash occurred at Issos in Cilicia. Ironically, many Egyptian troops served among the Persian ranks during these campaigns. Most were likely ordinary soldiers, loyal to whoever offered payment. But some members of Egypt's elite also lent their support. Among them, the eldest son of the exiled king Nakhthorheb, who appeared to see no conflict in aligning with the very power that had dethroned his father. Time and again, Egypt's military, regardless of rank, had shown a clear preference to back the side most likely to prevail. With their long and storied history, the Egyptians understood all too well that it was the victors who shaped the narrative. But Persia's days were numbered. One notable collaborator, Semetotefnacht, witnessed yet another devastating defeat for Darius. Realizing that Alexander's momentum seemed unstoppable, he was struck by a sudden urge to return home, whether from homesickness or a desire for self-preservation. He deserted the battlefield and made his way back to Egypt, ready to embrace a new regime and seize fresh opportunities under its rule. As tales of Alexander's military brilliance and unrelenting ambition reached the Nile Valley, many Egyptians began to wonder whether he might be the liberator they needed to end Persian domination. Lacking a native-born hero to rally behind, and with only two clear options, Darius or Alexander, the Macedonian began to seem the lesser evil. His reputation for brutality was already well known. After a brutal 7-month siege of Tyre in 332 BCE, Alexander punished the surviving defenders by having them publicly crucified. A few months later, Gaza's governor, who had dared to shut the city's gates against him, suffered an even grimmer fate. He was tied alive to a chariot and dragged around the city's perimeter until death finally claimed him. No one and nothing was permitted to stand in Alexander's path. Yet for the Egyptians, accustomed as they were to autocratic rulers, such displays of despotism were far from unfamiliar. For nearly 3 millennia, authoritarianism had been a central feature of life in the Nile Valley. As Egyptians looked wistfully to their once glorious past, many likely saw in Alexander the embodiment of a traditional pharaoh, unyielding, feared, and commanding respect. More crucially, he was a conqueror, a proven victor. And after years of subjugation and defeat, Egypt yearned for triumph, even if it came through someone else. In the final weeks of 332 BCE, Alexander crossed into Egypt and took control without encountering any resistance. The Persian forces simply vanished. Now, the conqueror of much of the known world stood on Egyptian soil. Whether by instinct or through shrewd counsel, he understood what was expected of him in this ancient land. One of his first gestures upon arriving in Memphis was to honor the sacred Apis bull. The revered animal was led out from its enclosure into a courtyard, where the curious Macedonian could observe it. To the Egyptians, this act signaled a revival of tradition. Here was a new ruler who respected their ancient rites. However, Alexander's interest in Egyptian religion went deeper than political theater. Like so many foreign conquerors before him, he was captivated by the richness and antiquity of Egyptian culture. Egypt had begun to exert its unique, almost magical charm upon him. Until then, nothing had slowed Alexander's relentless campaign. Each victory propelled him forward, denying his enemies any opportunity to regroup. Yet now, in a surprising break from his military momentum, he chose to turn away from the pursuit of Darius. In early 331 BCE, after founding a new city, Alexandria, that would forever bear his name, Alexander did not head east to confront the Persian king. Instead, he journeyed westward into the vast sands of the Sahara. His destination lay some 300 miles away, the Siwa oasis and its renowned oracle of Ammonius. What transpired between Alexander and the deity remains a mystery, but it marked a turning point. He emerged from the desert transformed, not merely a king, but a divine figure, proclaimed as son of the creator God himself. According to his own telling, he had received the answer his soul had longed to hear. And so, the Macedonian warlord became pharaoh of Egypt. It would be more than 2,000 years before a native-born Egyptian once again ruled the Nile Valley. Yet the legacy and power of Egypt's ancient civilization remained as potent and alluring as ever. In the end, Ptolemy and others like him had been vindicated. Alexander left Egypt in April 331 BCE, never to set foot there again. His visit had lasted only around 4 months. Yet, within that brief period, he had not only added Egypt to his expanding empire and been declared a living god, but he had also laid the groundwork for effective governance in the Nile Valley, anticipating both his own legacy and the future of his realm. Understanding that a military regime would not bring stability or prosperity to Egypt, Alexander established a clear division of authority. He left military control in Macedonian hands while assigning civil administration to 2 governors, one Egyptian and one Persian. Though deeply proud of his Greek heritage, Alexander envisioned a multicultural empire, one where individuals of all ethnic backgrounds could rise based on merit. Egypt may have come under Macedonian control, but local elites like Ptolemy could still gain recognition and power, secure in the belief that they were favored by their ruler and honored in their home regions. Alexander also made deliberate efforts to show respect for Egyptian customs and religion. His public reverence for the Apis bull was meant to portray him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator and a ruler who honored ancient traditions. Reflecting this spirit, Ptolemy posted a decree at the animal necropolis in Saqqara, forbidding soldiers from entering sacred areas. That document, preserved on papyrus, remains one of the oldest surviving Greek texts and stands as a testament to Alexander's inclusive policies. However, not all in Alexander's entourage shared his progressive ideals or concern for good governance. Soon after his departure, his carefully planned system began to unravel due to competing ambitions among his subordinates. The Egyptian governor stepped down, leaving the Persian official solely in charge of civil matters. Eventually, even he was sidelined as Cleomenes of Naucratis, a Greek commander responsible for eastern Egypt and its finances, was elevated to satrap, gaining broad authority. Despite Alexander's best intentions, Egypt was sliding back into authoritarian rule. When Alexander died unexpectedly on June 10, 323 BCE, the fate of Egypt was sealed. As his top generals fought over the division of his vast empire, one of them managed to secure control over Egypt. Having accompanied Alexander on his visit to the oracle of Ammonius, Ptolemy may have claimed a personal connection to the province. He also understood its strategic value. Wealthy, defensible, and capable of becoming a powerful kingdom once again. Wasting no time, Ptolemy moved into Egypt, removed the unpopular Cleomenes, and began to consolidate his rule. Yet assuming control of the 2 lands came with significant challenges. Though he held political and economic power, Ptolemy lacked the spiritual legitimacy that Alexander had enjoyed as a pharaoh. With Alexander gone, Egyptians might resist another Macedonian ruler. Ptolemy recognized that Alexander's symbolic approval would be crucial for his own acceptance. Although Alexander had wished to be buried at the temple of Ammonius in Siwa, the Macedonian regent, Perdiccas, had chosen instead to entomb him at Aegina with the Macedonian royal line for political purposes. Everyone, it seemed, sought possession of Alexander's body, viewing it as a source of legitimacy. Drawing upon his battlefield experience from the Near East, Ptolemy devised a bold and strategic plan to seize Alexander the Great's body right under the watch of Perdiccas. As the funeral procession journeyed from Babylon en route to the Hellespont, Ptolemy intercepted it in Syria, redirecting it to Egypt. Once Alexander's remains were secured on Egyptian soil, Ptolemy revealed his true motives. Rather than fulfilling the late conqueror's wish to be buried at Siwa, he instead laid the body to rest in Memphis, the historic seat of the pharaohs. By doing so, he cloaked himself in Alexander's legacy, making it nearly impossible to challenge his authority. Perdiccas was outraged by the maneuver, and it quickly escalated into open conflict between Egypt and Macedon. The first of many bitter struggles among Alexander's successors, a series of wars that would persist for 35 years. Meanwhile, the traditional Greek tendency toward ruthless, familial rivalries soon surfaced. Within a dozen years of Alexander's death, nearly all of his remaining relatives had been eliminated. His half-brother and designated heir, Philip III, was killed at the urging of Alexander's mother, Olympias. Later, Alexander's own son, born after his death, was murdered by his guardian. In Egypt, where maintaining appearances often took precedence over harsh truths, official records continued to count years as if the young Alexander IV were still alive and ruling. This fiction served as a political smokescreen, intended to give the illusion of loyalty while Ptolemy quietly pursued his own ambitions. A year before officially taking power, Ptolemy had relocated his residence to Alexandria, Alexander's coastal city. Once the new capital was complete, he acted decisively. On January 12, 304 BCE, he declared himself king. Among his first acts was to transfer Alexander's body to Alexandria, where it was placed in a grand new tomb within a glass-sided coffin. There, Alexander would rest forever, not merely as a military icon, but as the spiritual founder of a new city and dynasty. The Ptolemaic era had begun. The following 80 years, led by the first three Ptolemies, marked a golden age for Egypt. Though now a monarch, Ptolemy first retained his military prowess and used the prolonged wars of the successors to expand Egypt's influence across the eastern Mediterranean. In 313 BCE, he gained control of Cyprus, followed by key holdings in Anatolia and the Aegean. These supplemented Cyrenaica, which he had annexed just a year after Alexander's passing. In the early 280s, Ptolemy secured leadership over the Island League, affirming his dominance in the Cyclades. He further strengthened his position by forging alliances through marriages with prominent Macedonian families. When he died in the winter of 283 to 282 BCE at the age of 84, Ptolemy I had successfully built a protective buffer around Egypt, one that would endure for more than 250 years. The power struggle among Alexander's generals ultimately led to a tripartite division of his empire. To the northwest, Macedon retained its independence as his homeland. In the south, Egypt, along with Cyrenaica and Cyprus, came under the control of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. The vast central region fell to another of Alexander's lieutenants, Seleucus, who established the Seleucid Empire, a formidable rival to the Ptolemies. Tensions over territorial claims between these three Hellenistic powers persisted, especially during the reigns of Ptolemy II and III, culminating in the Syrian wars between Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom. These recurring wars offered Egypt a chance to push its boundaries further. Ptolemy II extended Egyptian influence into southern and western Anatolia, while Ptolemy III secured control of the Ionian coast, the Hellespont, and parts of southern Thrace. For the Ptolemies, expanding their territory was a strategic tool rather than a final objective. Across their dominions, trade stood at the core of state policy. Much like later global empires, Ptolemaic Egypt amassed extraordinary wealth through thriving commerce, supported by its vast natural resources. Early in his reign, Ptolemy II launched a military campaign against the Nubian kingdom of Meroe, successfully claiming control over Lower Nubia, a region rich in gold. To emphasize the conquest, he established a gold processing settlement in the Wadi Alaki, naming it Berenike Pankrysos in tribute to his formidable mother. This acquisition also gave Egypt access to African elephants, which were crucial for challenging the powerful Indian elephants deployed by the Seleucid forces. In another bold move, Ptolemy II ordered the ancient canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea to be cleared and reopened for navigation. Red Sea ports became gateways for maritime trade with India, while Nile vessels ventured into sub-Saharan Africa. Overland, caravans of camels crossed the Sahara to the west and extended trade eastward to Arabia. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt regained its position as a central hub in a global trading network. When it came to displaying their immense wealth and far-reaching connections, the Ptolemies spared no expense. During the winter of 275 to 274 BCE, Egypt hosted one of the most lavish spectacles the ancient world had ever seen. Inside a massive tent within the royal fortress, Ptolemy II and 130 hand-picked guests looked on as an extravagant ceremonial parade passed before them. The procession began with statues of the dynasty's divine patrons, Dionysus, Zeus, Alexander, Ptolemy I, and his queen Berenike. Next came tribute from distant lands, 24 wagons carrying elephants, along with antelopes, ostriches, wild asses, leopards, a giraffe, a rhinoceros, and countless camels. Nubians paraded bearing offerings, followed by vibrantly dressed Indian women, herds of cattle, and packs of dogs, all categorized simply as fauna by Ptolemy. The grand finale featured a military display of 80,000 Ptolemaic soldiers, reinforcing the connection between wealth and power. Unlike the pharaohs of old who had merely depicted tribute scenes on stone walls, the Ptolemies enacted them live. Perhaps the most striking departure from pharaonic tradition was the setting of this grandeur. Not in Thebes or Memphis, but in Alexandria, the gleaming capital of the Ptolemaic realm. Since its founding on April 7th, 331 BCE, Alexandria had risen to become the foremost commercial hub of the Mediterranean. Chosen personally by Alexander the Great, the city's location proved ideal, just under 20 miles from a major Nile outlet, but untouched by seasonal flooding. Its natural twin harbors, separated by a causeway, offered deep anchorage perfect for maritime trade. Along the bustling waterfront stood docks, warehouses, shipyards, and a vast trading center. Nearby were a theater and a temple dedicated to Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea. Inland, the city was designed with Hellenistic precision, laid out in a grid with two broad avenues, each 100 feet wide, intersecting at right angles. These streets framed the city's main public areas, including the central marketplace and important temples. As the heart of administration and royal life, palaces and sacred enclosures occupied between a quarter and a third of the urban landscape. The city boasted a royal tomb, towering statues, court buildings, and a grand gymnasium with colonnades, structures that blended Egyptian and Greek artistry, crafted from gleaming marble and polished granite. Alexandria was a meeting point of civilizations, a city where Hellenistic elegance and Egyptian tradition stood side by side. Yet despite its magnificence, some native Egyptians derided it as nothing more than a construction site. No institution embodied the Ptolemies' grand vision for Alexandria more profoundly than the Great Library. From the very beginning, Ptolemy I was determined to rival Athens and establish his new capital as the foremost center of learning in the Greek world. To achieve this, he founded a scholarly institution within the palace district, overseen by a priest devoted to the Muses. This institution, known as the Museum, quickly grew into a vibrant hub of research and education. The Ptolemies actively recruited the brightest minds from across the Hellenic world, enticing them with the promise of academic freedom and secure, state-funded salaries. The museum's facilities were designed to foster intellectual activity. Covered walkways offered quiet spaces for study and reflection, while a large banquet hall provided a venue for scholars to gather and exchange ideas. At its heart stood the library, no ordinary archive, but the most expansive collection of literature in the ancient world. The Ptolemies amassed books from every major literary center, sometimes through dubious means. So eager was Ptolemy III to obtain rare manuscripts that he engaged in calculated deception. He arranged to borrow original works from Athenian libraries, offering a generous deposit of 15 silver talents. Once the text arrived in Alexandria, he informed Athens that they could keep the money. He was keeping the books. At its peak, the great library housed around 500,000 papyrus scrolls, encompassing the full range of human knowledge. Its collection was matched by the brilliance of the minds it attracted. Though a few Egyptians were among its scholars, most hailed from across the Greek-speaking world. Euclid, drawn from Athens' Platonic school, compiled a unified framework for all known Greek mathematics. The legendary engineer Archimedes developed his water-lifting screw while in Egypt, and Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the sun at its center. In 245 BCE, Eratosthenes, a renowned geographer and astronomer, was appointed director of the library. During his time in Alexandria, he calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy by comparing the lengths of shadows in Aswan and Alexandria at the same time of day. Among his peers were physicians grounded in the Hippocratic tradition, who advanced the understanding of the body's nervous, digestive, and circulatory systems. Meanwhile, the court poet Callimachus meticulously organized the contents of the library, producing a detailed catalog that would help preserve Greek scholarship for future generations. Amid such intellectual brilliance, one monumental structure came to symbolize Alexandria's greatness in both a practical and symbolic sense: the Pharos Lighthouse. Rising from a rocky island connected to the mainland by a long causeway, the Pharos towered above the harbor. Initiated by Ptolemy I and completed by his successor in 280 BCE, the lighthouse was an engineering marvel. Built from massive stone blocks, each weighing roughly 75 tons, the structure consisted of 3 tiers, first square, then octagonal, and finally cylindrical. At its summit stood a colossal statue of Zeus, and beneath it, a brilliant beacon burned day and night. Its light, reflected and intensified by mirrors, could be seen from far out at sea, guiding ships into Alexandria. The Pharos served both as a vital navigation aid and a bold statement of Ptolemaic ambition. It was a shining beacon of Greek ingenuity and a powerful emblem of their dominance in Egypt. While the maritime world surrounding Alexandria was thoroughly Greek in character, the Nile Delta and the river valley presented a stark contrast. Under Ptolemaic rule, only 3 cities in Egypt were granted the status of autonomous Greek-style polis: Alexandria itself, Naucratis, an ancient trading hub, and the newly established city of Ptolemy in Upper Egypt, founded by Ptolemy I near Abydos to counterbalance the traditional influence of Thebes. Within these cities, citizens benefited from preferential tax treatment and the right to elect their own local magistrates. Thousands of immigrants from across the Greek world were drawn to Egypt, viewing it as a land rich with opportunity in commerce and finance. Naturally, they gravitated toward these existing centers of Greek life. As a result, Alexandria, Naucratis, and Ptolemy quickly evolved into cosmopolitan cities, where Sicilians, Illyrians, Thracians, Ionians, and Carians lived side by side. Meanwhile, vast portions of rural Egypt, where native Egyptians remained the majority, experienced little change from this influx and largely retained their traditional character. This divide formed a deep cultural and social fault line in Ptolemaic society. Though the Pharos lighthouse symbolized opportunity, it was no symbol of equality. A privileged Greek elite of officials, merchants, and soldiers dominated political and economic life, while the Egyptian peasantry continued to farm the land, much as they always had. The Ptolemies readily embraced the autocratic style of rule perfected by the ancient pharaohs, but placed power in the hands of a small circle of Greek-speaking loyalists. The traditional Egyptian vizier, once the top administrator of the land, was replaced by a new official, the dioichetes. Subordinate administrators with equally foreign-sounding titles managed various branches of government, from the hypomnematographus, the chief secretary based in Alexandria, to the strategos, the provincial governor tasked with overseeing local affairs and maintaining royal control over the Egyptian population. This elite class had their gymnasia, exclusive centers of Greek male culture and education. They spoke, wrote, and thought in Greek, and many of them still considered themselves Greek even after generations of living in Egypt. They also operated under a separate legal code, brought from their homeland. While Greeks were judged under their own system, native Egyptians continued to have their cases heard by traditional pharaonic courts. The result was a society governed by two parallel systems of law, one for those in power and another for the rest. In rural areas, particularly in regions like the Fayum, where large numbers of Greek military settlers were stationed, the local population had little choice but to adapt to the foreign presence. It became common for lower-ranking bureaucrats to adopt dual identities, using Greek names in their official capacities while retaining their Egyptian names in private life. In typical villages, such as Kirkiasiris, Greek religious practices existed alongside native traditions. Shrines to Zeus and the divine twins Castor and Pollux stood beside sanctuaries dedicated to ancient Egyptian deities like Isis, Thoth, Badet, and Ammonius. Even in Memphis, a historically diverse city with a bustling port, the cultural divide persisted, with each ethnic community residing in its own distinct quarter. The challenge facing the Ptolemies was how to forge unity in a kingdom composed of diverse peoples, languages, and traditions, how to avoid the deepening of cultural and ethnic divisions. As had often been the case in Egypt's long history, the answer lay in religion. Animal cults, a long-established feature of traditional Egyptian belief, offered a potential bridge. Ptolemy I took great care to honor these sacred traditions, especially the veneration of the Apis bull in Memphis, one of the most ancient and revered cults tied to the concept of divine kingship since Egypt's earliest dynasties. To complement the existing sanctuary at Saqqara, Ptolemy first constructed a second complex in Alexandria, this one dedicated to the god Osiris Apis, better known in the Greek world as Serapis. Pilgrims from across the Hellenistic world journeyed to visit the two great serapeums. However, the native Egyptians remained largely unmoved. To them, Serapis was clearly not one of their gods. In time, the Ptolemaic state ceased its financial support for the cult, recognizing its failure to win over the local population. A more effective strategy was the Ptolemaic attempt to blend Hellenistic and Egyptian ideas of kingship into a unified royal cult. Alexander's life and veneration after death had demonstrated the persuasive power of the Greek model. Meanwhile, the Egyptian notion of divine kingship remained a potent symbol. By merging these two traditions, the Ptolemies sought to create a ruler cult that would resonate with both Greeks and Egyptians. Initially, the Hellenistic concept of the basileus, or king, dominated. Ptolemy I actively promoted the cult of Alexander, aligning himself with it to legitimize his rule. He elevated Alexander to divine status as the new state god and positioned the priest of Alexander as the most powerful religious figure in the kingdom. Ptolemy himself showed no reluctance in pursuing divinity. On the island of Rhodes, he accepted worship during his lifetime. After his death, he was officially deified in Egypt, and a festival in his honor was held every 4 years in Alexandria, complete with parades, sacrifices, feasts, and athletic games. Ptolemy II took this practice even further. He established divine cults for various members of his family, including his lovers. His famous procession of 275 to 274 BCE celebrated the military and material power that underpinned his kingship, yet he also took steps to reinforce his identity as a legitimate Egyptian ruler. Early in his reign, he toured many of Egypt's most sacred temples, especially those devoted to traditional animal cults, to fulfill his obligations as a pharaoh. Statues of himself and his relatives were placed in the Serapeum at Saqqara, displayed alongside representations of the Apis bull and other native deities. Like the pharaohs before him, Ptolemy II commissioned grand temple complexes as a sign of devotion. One of the most significant projects was the Temple of Isis at Philae, located near the first cataract of Nile. Construction and restoration work also took place at key religious sites such as Ipit Sut, Jebtu, known to the Greeks as Coptos, Unit, Tintiris, Saqqara, and Perhebit, Izium, in the Delta. These native temples were strongholds of Egyptian tradition, resolutely independent institutions that actively resisted foreign influences to preserve the customs of pharaonic religion. By taking on the role of royal benefactor in the traditional way, Ptolemy II hoped to win the support of the native populace and ease their resistance to foreign rule. Temples were not only religious centers, but also major landholders and economic hubs. Their wealth made them essential to the state's financial strategy. To access these valuable resources, Ptolemy installed royal agents within temple estates, trusted officials responsible for safeguarding the crown's economic interests. Egypt's legendary prosperity had always relied on its fertile lands and agricultural abundance. From the very beginning, the Ptolemies were intent on fully harnessing the potential of their newly acquired realm. The dynasty's founder established the city of Ptolemais in a region known for its productive farmland. He also launched a bold initiative in the Fayum, transforming vast stretches of desert into arable fields through irrigation. This ambitious effort resulted in a threefold increase in cultivable land across the region. Under Ptolemy II, an extraordinary feat of engineering was accomplished with the creation of an artificial lake in southern Fayum, capable of holding 360 million cubic yards of water. This reservoir enabled irrigation for approximately 60 square miles of farmland. Since these lands had been reclaimed from unclaimed desert, they were free from any traditional ownership rights, and their agricultural output flowed directly into the royal treasury. Throughout the countryside, the government's most basic officials focused their efforts almost exclusively on agricultural matters. Their primary duty was to assess how much land the state could lease to tenant farmers and estimate the income it would generate. Twice a year, these scribes were summoned to the provincial capital to meet with the Greek-appointed governor in the records office. The first meeting in February prepared for the annual survey of crops and land use, and the second, held a month later, reviewed the results of that survey. Later, in early summer, scribes from across the land gathered in Alexandria to report to the Dioiketes, the top financial officer. This administrative process underscored a consistent truth. Regardless of who ruled, the economic interests of the state remained paramount. Like many colonial regimes before and after, the Ptolemaic administration focused on extracting maximum profit from the land, with little regard for the consequences. Lower Egypt was burdened with a land tax, while Upper Egypt was subject to a tax on its harvest. Fees for government positions were steep, and even minor officials like village scribes were required to pay commissions upon appointment or renewal. They also had to lease crown land at inflated annual rates as a condition of their post. Gradually, the state introduced a new economic order, one that prioritized wheat cultivation, relied on intermediaries for tax collection, and employed every possible strategy to increase revenue. These measures transformed Egypt into the richest and most powerful of all Hellenistic kingdoms. Yet this wealth came at a cost. The relentless pressure to extract resources created social strain and unrest. Though long subordinate in their own land, Egypt's native population would not remain silent and passive forever. While the Ptolemies sought to portray themselves as divinely sanctioned and benevolent rulers, this self-image was far from universally accepted. Just 2 generations into Greek control of Egypt, discontent among the local population began to boil over in response to the harsh economic policies imposed by their foreign overlords. In 245 BCE, during the Third Syrian War, Ptolemy III was forced to abandon his military campaign to suppress a native uprising. Although this particular revolt was brief and relatively minor, it foreshadowed the deeper unrest that lay ahead. For the next 30 years, resentment simmered beneath the surface, kept in check only by the heavy-handed mechanisms of Ptolemaic repression. Ironically, it was a celebrated military triumph that pushed this unrest to a breaking point. In 217 BCE, after 2 years of hostilities in the Fourth Syrian War, the armies of Ptolemaic Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom clashed near the town of Raphia. To sustain the war effort, Ptolemy IV raised taxes even further, placing additional strain on an already burdened population. In a marked departure from earlier royal disdain for native troops, he also enlisted a large number of Egyptian soldiers, though they were equipped and trained in the Macedonian fashion. On the eve of battle, Ptolemy IV attempted to assume the role of a traditional pharaoh, delivering a speech to his forces. But the illusion fell flat. His words had to be translated from Greek into Egyptian, revealing the disconnect between ruler and people. Despite this, the Ptolemaic army narrowly won the Battle of Raphia. The king celebrated the victory by immortalizing his image on temple walls, presenting himself as a heroic conqueror and ruler of Syria. Yet this would be the last time a Ptolemaic monarch displayed such assertiveness. The 20,000 Egyptian troops, now experienced and emboldened by battle, soon mutinied. Their revolt ignited widespread rebellion throughout the Nile Delta. Disillusioned peasants abandoned their villages and took to the countryside, forming bands of outlaws. Greek military outposts and Egyptian temples were attacked. Even the rival kings of Macedon and the Seleucid Empire offered their assistance to Ptolemy to suppress the unrest, setting aside their rivalry. But their support proved ineffective. Before long, civil war engulfed Lower Egypt. The spirit of resistance spread southward. Inspired by the chaos in the north, the citizens of Thebes launched their own rebellion. Since the decline of the new kingdom, Upper Egypt had long harbored aspirations of independence. The Ptolemies' neglect of the southern regions, preferring to rule from distant Alexandria, only deepened local resentment. In an attempt to appease Theban sentiment, Ptolemy IV ordered construction of a grand temple to Horus in Geba, located in the far south. But this gesture came too late. A contemporary Egyptian text, the Demise Chronicle, harshly criticized the Ptolemies for failing to uphold Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and justice, and foretold the rise of a native king who would overthrow the foreign rulers. That prophecy soon materialized. In 206 BCE, a dynamic rebel leader emerged victorious in an early confrontation with government forces. Within months, he seized control of the sacred city of Thebes and was formally declared pharaoh, receiving the endorsement of the powerful Ammonius priesthood. Known as Horwenifer, or beloved of Ammoniusare, king of the gods, he assumed power in the autumn of 205 BC. From Abydos in the north to Inerti, Greek Papyrus, in the south, Upper Egypt was once more under native control. Land records were destroyed, oppressive tax policies were abolished, and Greek settlers were driven from their homes. Ptolemaic authority crumbled across the region. For a brief and electrifying moment, it seemed that Egypt might once again free itself from foreign rule, just as it had done at earlier pivotal moments in its long history. The Ptolemies had a different vision. By the end of 200 BCE, the newly crowned Ptolemy V launched a counteroffensive from Alexandria. Greek forces advanced southward from their strongholds in the Delta and the Fayum. By early 199 BCE, they had reclaimed the city of Ptolemy, and as the seasons shifted into autumn, they laid siege to the sacred site of Abydos. After capturing the religious center dedicated to Osiris-Swinifer from the rebel faction, the army pressed on to Thebes, scoring another decisive victory. The spirit of resistance quickly faded into hopelessness as the rebels lost both their capital and their leader. Horwenifer's death in mid-autumn 199 BCE could have marked the collapse of the Theban rebellion. Yet, a successor named Anquinifer swiftly stepped in, continuing the established calendar of reigns as if no interruption had occurred. Still, with the Ptolemaic forces now holding Thebes and another Greek garrison entrenched at Aswan, Anquinifer found himself facing severe constraints. In a daring move, he chose to strike northward, possibly taking the desert routes, and targeted the region of Saudi, located nearly 190 miles from Thebes. His campaign aimed to inflict as much destruction as possible to isolate the Greek forces stationed in Thebes, cut off their supply lines, and sever their communication with Alexandria. The strategy proved effective. Eventually, the Ptolemaic troops were compelled to abandon Thebes and withdraw south. The rebellion had regained momentum. Frustrated by the persistent defiance in Upper Egypt, Ptolemy I redirected his focus to the insurgents in the Delta. In 197 BCE, his army besieged the rebels' heavily fortified and well-supplied headquarters. Despite their determination, the rebels could not stand up to the overwhelming firepower and superior military organization of the Ptolemaic army. The stronghold was captured, and the leaders of the revolt were taken to Memphis, where they were publicly executed by impalement, a brutal act staged as part of the king's coronation celebrations. This symbolic event, which took place on March 26, 196 BCE, fused politics and religion in a distinctly Egyptian manner. It was formally commemorated in a royal proclamation carved in both the Egyptian and Greek languages and in 3 writing systems: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. This monumental text has endured through the ages, better known today as the Rosetta Stone. Emboldened by his decisive triumph in the Delta, Ptolemy V redirected his focus to Thebes. The Ptolemaic army first drove the rebel forces out of the Saudi region in a brutal clash that left the land devastated. By autumn of 191 BCE, Anquinifer abandoned Thebes and fled toward the Nubian frontier, his choices dwindling rapidly. Once Thebes was retaken, the authorities organized a public auction of lands seized from the rebels. Restoring cultivation meant tax revenues could begin flowing once more. With Greek forces advancing on Aswan, well provisioned with grain from throughout Egypt, Anquinifer recognized the futility of continued resistance. Even with military aid from Nubia, the Egyptian insurgents suffered final defeat on August 27, 186 BCE. Anquinifer's son fell in battle, and the rebel leader himself was captured and imprisoned. His life was spared only by the intervention of a religious council convened in Alexandria shortly after. The priests advised Ptolemy V that executing Anquinifer would only make him a martyr. Instead, they urged the king to brand him a traitor to the gods but grant him clemency. Reluctantly, Ptolemy agreed and issued a sweeping amnesty decree, calling on all fugitives to return to their villages and farmlands. As part of his strategy to win back native support, the king also resumed construction on temple projects, notably at Jeba, which had been halted when the uprising began in 206 BCE. Yet alongside these reconciliatory efforts, Ptolemy moved to enforce tighter military control over Upper Egypt. For the first time, loyal Greek troops were granted land in southern communities. The governor in Ptolemy was given full command over both civil and military affairs, and new army encampments were established near Thebes at Sumanu and Inerti. The south would be far less forgiving for any future revolt. Ptolemy's final act of reprisal was reserved for the northern insurgents who had originally sparked the rebellion. In 185 BCE, under the guise of peace negotiation, he summoned them to the city of Sais, a long-standing symbol of resistance in Lower Egypt dating back to the time of Tefnakht. Too late, they realized they had walked into a trap. On the king's command, they were stripped naked, yoked like oxen to carts, and paraded through the streets before the horrified eyes of the local people, then tortured to death. Ptolemaic clemency had its boundaries. Meanwhile, strife within the royal family continued unabated. By the late 3rd century BCE, internal discord was growing more acute, further inflamed by constant uprisings. When Ptolemy V inherited the throne in 204 BCE at just 6 years old, his mother was assassinated by powerful officials at court. These same officials then fought among themselves for dominance, plunging the government into deeper disarray. As internal divisions worsened, the kingdom's foreign power crumbled. Egypt lost its overseas holdings in Syria, Anatolia, and Thrace. By the time Ptolemy I died in 180 BCE, the once powerful empire had been profoundly weakened. And as Hellenistic rule faltered across the eastern Mediterranean, a rising young power looked on, its ambitions fixed squarely on the region's unraveling future. The Latins were among several Italic tribes that traced their lineage back to early settlers who had migrated into the Italian peninsula during the time of the Sea Peoples. According to their own legend, the Latins founded a city on the banks of the Tiber River in 753 BCE. This settlement, Rome, steadily expanded its power and influence. By 338 BCE, it had brought the surrounding Latium region under control, and within the next 80 years, it had conquered the entirety of peninsular Italy, even displacing Greek colonists in the process. It's no surprise, then, that the Ptolemies were eager to establish cordial relations with such a rising power. So in 273 BCE, fresh from the success of his grand procession and more self-assured than ever, Ptolemy II initiated a formal diplomatic exchange with Rome. That treaty of friendship marked the beginning of a long, tangled, and ultimately destructive relationship. From the beginning, the Ptolemies viewed the Romans with a mix of aloof superiority and eager admiration, a familiar posture for established empires confronting ambitious newcomers. Hoping to gain favor, and despite an existing alliance with Carthage on the North African coast, Ptolemaic Egypt remained neutral during the First Punic War. Rome, in turn, rewarded this passive support by sending a delegation of thanks. The same strategic behavior defined Rome's interventions in the ongoing conflicts between the Ptolemies and their Macedonian and Seleucid adversaries. Posing as a loyal ally of Egypt, Rome used these rivalries to expand its own reach in international affairs. Amid such endless bickering among Hellenistic powers, Rome's rise as the dominant force in the Mediterranean was almost inevitable. Like his father before him, Ptolemy VI ascended the throne at just 6 years old. With his mother serving as regent, Egypt enjoyed a brief period of stability during the first 4 years of his reign. But after her death in 176 BCE, factional power struggles within the court came to the surface, leading to the establishment of a joint rule. From then on, Ptolemy VI, his sister, and his younger brother Ptolemy VIII ruled as co-monarchs, an arrangement doomed to fail. The Sixth Syrian War proved disastrous. Ptolemy VI, attempting to broker peace with the Seleucids, was deposed by the angry citizens of Alexandria. Seizing the opportunity, Seleucid king Antiochus claimed to act in support of Ptolemy VI, but in reality aimed to expand his own territory. He laid siege to Alexandria, though he eventually abandoned the campaign due to unrest at home. The situation reflected the familiar pattern of internal rivalry, territorial ambition, and native resistance that plagued many Hellenistic regimes. It was at this chaotic moment that the Romans stepped in to restore order. When Antiochus returned to threaten Alexandria again in 168 BCE, Rome intervened decisively. That summer, the Roman envoy Popilius confronted Antiochus at Eleusis, just outside Alexandria. With remarkable boldness, he demanded that Antiochus immediately halt all hostilities and withdraw entirely from Egypt and Cyprus. Intimidated, Antiochus submitted without protest. This encounter, later known as the Day of Eleusis, became legendary as the day Rome rescued Egypt, though it marked the beginning of Egypt's loss of independence. For the remaining 130 years of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, it was Roman influence, not Greek power, that dictated the course of events in Egypt. As internal disputes between Ptolemy VI and his siblings sapped the strength of the state, Rome became more frequently involved, called upon to back one claimant or another. The result was an ever-tightening Roman grip on Egyptian politics. At the same time, rebel uprisings continued to erupt in Upper Egypt, exploiting the political vacuum at the center. In 165 BCE, Thebes rose in rebellion. The unrest spread to the Fayum, where rebels torched land records, farmers abandoned their homes, and fugitives took shelter in temples. In response, Ptolemy VI issued a decree mandating the leasing and cultivation of farmland, but the edict was both ineffective and deeply unpopular. Eventually, he was forced into exile. Unsurprisingly, he turned to Rome for refuge. Ptolemy VIII did not fare any better than his predecessors. Within a year of taking power, his brutal and oppressive rule sparked widespread calls for the return of his brother. Desperate to hold onto authority, he turned to Rome for support. During his exile in Cyrenaica, and following a failed assassination attempt around 156 to 155 BCE, Ptolemy VIII drafted a will promising his kingdom to Rome should he die without a legitimate heir. This move had the desired effect of intimidating his rivals, but it further eroded Egypt's autonomy. It wasn't until the death of Ptolemy VI in 145 BCE that Ptolemy VIII was finally able to reclaim the throne. Upon his return to Alexandria, Ptolemy VIII married his sister and allegedly ordered the murder of her son from her previous marriage during the wedding festivities. The act was in line with his notoriously cruel and ruthless character. He carried out severe punishments against Jewish military commanders who had resisted his authority and expelled many prominent Greek intellectuals from the city. To counterbalance the hostility of the immigrant elites, he deliberately sought favor with the native Egyptians, supporting their temples and issuing general pardons. Although transparently opportunistic, this strategy proved effective. Accustomed to harsh rulers, the local population largely ignored his atrocities and stood by him. The royal family's internal dynamics, never simple, grew increasingly chaotic. Ptolemy took the extraordinary step of marrying the younger daughter of his wife in 141 BCE and made her queen. This led to fierce rivalry between mother and daughter. As tensions escalated into civil war in 132 BCE, Ptolemy fled with his younger wife to Cyprus, while his estranged queen was declared sole ruler in Alexandria. Concerned that their son might be declared king in his absence, Ptolemy had the child abducted, brought to Cyprus, and murdered in front of him. He then had the boy's body dismembered and sent the remains back to the queen to arrive just before her birthday. Displaying political shrewdness despite personal tragedy, she exhibited the mutilated corpse publicly in Alexandria to stir outrage against her former husband. Yet the native population remained loyal to Ptolemy. His cold calculation had once again paid off. With strong backing from the Egyptians, Ptolemy VIII regained control of Egypt. He rewarded their loyalty by promoting Egyptians to high-ranking positions, something that had not been done in 2 centuries. Officials like the royal scribe Winifred echoed the grandiose self-praise of Egypt's ancient elite. "I was honored by my father, praised by my mother, generous to my brothers, beloved in my town, gracious in my province, admired by all." But along with the flattery came indulgent excess that marked the decline of traditional values. "I loved drinking, presided over feasts, surrounded by singers and beautiful maidens with braided hair and full figures who danced to delight my heart." This decadence reflected the broader decay of Egyptian society. The population was mirroring the behavior of its leaders. After reclaiming Alexandria, Ptolemy made a dramatic show of vengeance by surrounding and burning the city's gymnasium, killing everyone inside. This kind of senseless brutality, coupled with rampant corruption, only accelerated Egypt's downward spiral. Ptolemy VIII died in the summer of 116 BCE in Alexandria, leaving the throne to his young wife and whichever of her 2 sons she chose to succeed him. Meanwhile, far to the south at Philae, a group of Roman visitors carved their names into the temple of Isis, leaving behind the oldest known Latin inscriptions in Egypt. These 2 events captured the essence of Egypt's fading past and uncertain future. As the Ptolemaic Dynasty descended into further strife, Rome's influence grew ever stronger. 20 years later, Cyrenaica officially became Roman territory, leaving Cyprus as Egypt's only overseas holding. History repeated itself when Ptolemy IX and X, 2 royal brothers, fought over the crown, while more unrest erupted in Upper Egypt. Another Ptolemaic ruler offered Rome his kingdom in exchange for military aid, and further violence broke out in the capital. Among all the traditions that had once defined Egyptian identity, only devotion to the old gods endured. For that reason alone, there was great rejoicing in 70 BCE when the monumental temple of Horus at Geba was finally completed. Though built in the Ptolemaic era, the temple was unmistakably pharaonic in spirit. With its massive stone pylons and pillared halls, it represented the fusion of Hellenistic form and Egyptian faith that the Greek rulers had long tried to achieve. The crowds who witnessed its dedication must have hoped they were seeing the birth of a renewed era of peace and prosperity. Those same hopes likely surrounded the birth of a new royal child a few months later. Of mixed heritage, the infant daughter of Ptolemy I carried the future of a divided land on her shoulders. Her life would be dedicated to defending her country's independence. Her death would mark the end of pharaonic Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra,